The wind howled like a wounded beast, driving snow sideways across the barren Wyoming plains. Ethan Sawyer tracked the wolf through the blinding white, his breath forming clouds that dissipated instantly in the biting cold. The predator had been stalking his cattle for weeks, growing bolder with each kill. 3 calves lost already, a loss he couldn't afford. His horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty, snorted beneath him, hooves crunching through the crusted snow. Ethan patted the animal's neck with a gloved hand, steadying him as another gust whipped around them. Through narrowed eyes he caught a flash of movement, gray against white, disappearing behind a rocky outcropping ahead. "Easy boy," he murmured, lifting his Winchester rifle from its scabbard. He dismounted with practiced efficiency, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the snow. The former Army scout moved with deliberate silence, each step calculated, despite the howling wind. At 38, Ethan still possessed the wiry strength and sharp instincts that had kept him alive through the Civil War and its bloody aftermath. The wolf appeared suddenly larger than he'd expected, lean and desperate from the harsh winter. Its yellow eyes locked on Ethan's, neither predator willing to retreat. The animal snarled, hackles raised muscles, tensing to spring. Ethan raised his rifle in one fluid motion. The crack of the shot echoed across the empty landscape, but not before the wolf lunged. Sharp teeth grazed his shoulder as the animal's momentum carried it past him. Ethan stumbled backward, feeling the warm wetness of blood seeping through his coat, where the wolf's fangs had torn fabric and flesh. The wolf lay still in the crimson-stained snow, dead. Ethan pressed his hand against his wounded shoulder, wincing. Not deep, but it needed tending. He'd seen men die from less during the war infection, taking what bullets couldn't. Daylight was fading fast. He whistled for Rusty, secured the wolf's carcass behind his saddle, and mounted with effort, his shoulder protesting. The ride back to his homestead would be cold and painful, but necessary. Another storm was building on the horizon. His trance-like focus on the trail home broke only when he saw smoke rising from his cabin's chimney. Ethan hadn't left a fire burning. His hand moved instinctively to his holster as he approached his own property with newfound caution. The small homestead, 60 acres with a cabin barn and half-broken corral, looked peaceful enough under its blanket of snow. But something was wrong. Dismounting carefully, Ethan noticed footprints leading to his door, small prints half filled with fresh snow. Not boot prints. Bare feet. Inside the barn, he quickly unsaddled Rusty, hanging the wolf carcass from a rafter to skin later. The pain in his shoulder had intensified, but concern for the intruder kept his mind sharp. Back outside, he followed the mysterious tracks to his cabin door, drawing his Colt revolver before pushing it open. The warmth hit him first, then the smell, unfamiliar yet not unpleasant, something earthy and sweet. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior lit only by the fireplace. That's when he saw her. She was huddled in the corner farthest from the door, a blanket clutched around her shoulders, eyes wide with fear, but defiant. A young woman with copper skin and raven-black hair that fell loose around a face marked by exhaustion and weariness. Her deerskin dress was torn at the side, revealing a wound that had left dried blood on her leg. A Cheyenne woman. In his cabin. Ethan kept his revolver pointed toward the floor, not directly at her, but not holstering it either. They regarded each other in tense silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire she had apparently stoked from his dying embers. "Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't answer immediately, her dark eyes taking in his bloodied shoulder, the revolver in his hand, his face. When she spoke, her voice was low and steady despite her obvious fear. "Let me stay here," she said in accented but clear English, "and I'll give you what no white woman can." Ethan's jaw tightened at the implication. He'd heard stories of desperate Indian women making such offers to white settlers, trappers, soldiers, trading the only currency they had left for safety. The thought sickened him. He holstered his revolver slowly. "You're wounded," he said, nodding toward her leg. She glanced down, but said nothing. Pulling his blanket, he noted tighter around herself. "I'm going to put my gun away," he said, moving deliberately to hang his revolver and rifle on their pegs by the door. "Then I'm going to tend to my shoulder. You can stay by the fire." He turned his back to her, a calculated risk that conveyed more than words could. Moving to the small wash basin, he shrugged off his heavy coat with a grimace, then peeled back his torn shirt to examine the wolf bite. 2 puncture wounds, not deep, but bleeding freely now that he'd removed his clothing. In the corner of his eye, he could see her watching him, curiosity mingling with the fear on her face. "Wolf?" she asked, surprising him. Ethan nodded. "It was after my cattle." She seemed to consider this, then slowly rose, keeping the blanket around her shoulders. He tensed as she approached, but she merely pointed to a jar on his shelf. "That, for wound." It was a jar of honey, the last from his rare trips to town. Before he could respond, she had taken it down and was standing before him, her movements cautious but determined. "Sit," she instructed. Something in her tone made him comply. She set the jar on the table and found a clean cloth, then dipped it in the water basin. With unexpected gentleness, she cleaned his wound, her touch clinical rather than intimate. "My name is Ethan," he said, breaking the strange silence. "Ethan Sawyer." She paused in her ministrations, regarding him with those deep, wary eyes. "Nayeli," she replied finally. "Nayeli," he repeated, testing the name. "What does it mean?" "I love you," she translated, a hint of irony in her voice. "Not for you, for my people." She opened the honey jar and applied it directly to his wound, then bound it with a strip of clean cloth. As she worked, Ethan noticed something metallic caught in the tear of her dress, reflecting the firelight. "You're hurt, too," he said when she'd finished with his shoulder. Nayeli retreated a step, wariness returning to her face. "I will heal." "Let me look," he insisted, rising from his chair. "Fair trade." She hesitated, then gave a short nod, allowing him to guide her to the chair he'd vacated. Her leg wound was a deep gash, partially scabbed over, but still angry and red at the edges. As he cleaned it gently, the metal object became visible, a small insignia, a military badge embedded in the wound. Ethan recognized it instantly. The emblem of the 7th Cavalry, the regiment notorious for brutal campaigns against the Plains tribes, including a massacre of Cheyenne villagers the previous spring. His stomach tightened. This woman hadn't just been injured. She'd been running from soldiers. He carefully removed the badge, setting it aside without comment. Nayeli's eyes followed his movements, but her face remained impassive. She had noticed his recognition. "This needs stitching," he said, indicating the wound. "Do it," she replied simply. Ethan found needle and thread in a small sewing kit, once his wife Margaret's now rarely used. His large hands worked with surprising dexterity, a skill learned from necessity during war. Nayeli didn't flinch as he sewed her wound closed, though he knew it must hurt terribly. When he finished, he bandaged the injury with clean cloth, then moved away to give her space. Only then did he notice how thin she was, how exhaustion lined her young face. Whatever had driven her to his doorstep had been desperate indeed. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving to the small pantry. The flicker in her eyes was answer enough. Ethan took out dried venison beans and half a loaf of bread, meager offerings, but all he had. He set them on the table between them, then filled 2 tin cups with water from the bucket by the door. Nayeli ate slowly, with dignity, despite her obvious hunger. Each bite measured, each swallow deliberate, like someone accustomed to making little last. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the cabin's shutters. The storm he'd seen on the horizon was arriving. Ethan stoked the fire, adding logs to keep the bitter cold at bay. Night had fallen completely now, trapping them together in the small cabin illuminated only by firelight. When she'd finished eating, Nayeli looked toward him expectantly, her hands falling to the belt of her torn dress. "No," Ethan said firmly, understanding her intent. "That's not why I helped you." Confusion crossed her face, quickly masked. Then why? It was a fair question, one Ethan wasn't entirely sure he could answer. 4 years he'd lived alone on this homestead, keeping to himself, speaking to others only when necessary. The war had hollowed him out. Losing Margaret to cholera while he was away scouting had finished the job. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And I'm not the kind of man who turns away someone who needs help." She studied him clearly, trying to determine if he was telling the truth. Whatever she saw in his face must have convinced her, because she nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "You can have the bed," he said, gesturing to the simple frame against the far wall. "I'll take the chair." Again that look of confusion. "Why?" "Because you're wounded and exhausted," he explained. "And it's the decent thing to do." Nayeli rose cautiously and moved to the bed, still watching him as if expecting him to change his mind. She sat on the edge, not lying down, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Ethan took his rifle and settled into the chair near the door, positioning it so he could watch both the entrance and his unexpected guest. The wound in his shoulder throbbed dully, but the honey seemed to be helping with the pain. "You're safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure why he felt the need to reassure her. "Get some rest." Still, she watched him, unmoving. For how long? The question hung in the air between them. Ethan hadn't thought beyond the moment, beyond the storm howling outside, and the wounded woman in his cabin. "Until you're healed enough to decide what you want to do next," he said finally. This seemed to satisfy her. Nayeli lay down slowly, pulling the quilt over herself, though she kept her face turned toward him. Ethan tipped his hat forward over his eyes, but didn't sleep. He listened to the wind battering the cabin, and eventually to the slow, even breathing of the woman in his bed. Dawn arrived with eerie silence. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine blanket of snow across the landscape. Ethan had dozed in the chair, rifle propped where he could reach it without thinking. His neck ached from the awkward position, but he remained still for a moment, listening. The soft sound of movement drew his attention. Nayeli stood by the wash basin, her back to him. She had removed the blanket, and in the gray morning light, he could see the full extent of her injuries for the first time. Bruises marked her back and arms, evidence of violence that made his jaw clench. She sensed his gaze and turned her expression guarded. Without a word, she returned to her task of washing her face and hands in the cold water. Ethan rose stiffly and moved to the stove, adding kindling and striking a match. The familiar routine of morning, lighting the stove, putting coffee on to boil, checking supplies, felt strange with another person in the small space. Yet there was something almost companionable about their shared silence. When the coffee was ready, he poured a cup and offered it to her. Nayeli approached cautiously, accepting the steaming mug with both hands. She sniffed it, then took a tentative sip. Her nose wrinkled slightly at the bitter taste, but she drank it anyway. "Thank you," she said, the words seeming to cost her something. Ethan nodded, pouring his own cup. "I need to check the cattle, tend to the wolf I shot. You should rest." She shook her head. "I help." "Your leg." "I help," she repeated more firmly this time. Not. She searched for the word charity. He understood then. Pride, dignity, the need to earn her keep, to not be indebted. He recognized it because he carried the same within himself. All right, he conceded. But don't push too hard. Wound reopens, you'll be laid up longer. Nayeli gave a short nod, finishing her coffee. She moved to put on her torn dress, but Ethan stopped her with a raised hand. He went to a trunk at the foot of the bed and pulled out a faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn trousers. These might fit better. Warmer, too. She took the clothes with visible surprise. They were clean if well worn, and far too big for her slender frame. But when she emerged from behind the privacy screen, he'd improvised with a blanket she had managed to make them workable. The shirt was belted at her waist with a length of rope, the trousers rolled up several times. The overall effect was incongruous, but oddly fitting. Outside, the bitter cold stung their faces. Nayeli's bare feet sank into the snow, and she inhaled sharply at the shock. Wait here, Ethan said, returning to the cabin. He came back with a pair of thick wool socks and his spare boots, still far too large for her, but better than nothing. She sat on the porch step to pull them on, stuffing the toes with extra socks to make them somewhat functional. Together, they trudged through the snow to the barn. Inside, the wolf carcass hung where Ethan had left it. Nayeli approached it without fear, examining the animal with knowing eyes. Big male, she observed. Old. Ethan nodded. Been after my cattle for weeks. Hungry winter? She said simply, running a hand over the wolf's thick fur. Hard to hunt. There was no judgment in her voice, just acknowledgement of the harsh reality they all faced, man, beast, and nature locked in the eternal struggle for survival. While Ethan skinned the wolf, its pelt would make a good blanket, or trade item in town, Nayeli fed the horses and checked their hooves for ice moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to such work. She spoke little, but he noticed how she whispered to the animals in her native tongue, calming them with a touch and soft words he couldn't understand. When they moved on to the cattle huddled in the lee of a windbreak he'd constructed, Ethan was surprised by her knowledge. She pointed out a cow that was favoring one leg, then demonstrated how to check for frostbite on their ears and tails. You know cattle, he remarked, as they headed back to the cabin, arms laden with firewood. My father's people, after reservation. Her face darkened at the mention of the reservation. They give us cattle. Most die. We learn hard way. It was the most she'd said about herself since arriving, and Ethan sensed the pain behind her clipped sentences. The reservation system was a cruel joke, forcing proud nomadic people onto the poorest land, then expecting them to become farmers overnight with inadequate tools and supplies. Back inside the cabin, Ethan set about preparing a simple meal of beans and the last of his bacon. Nayeli took up mending her torn dress without being asked, her nimble fingers working the needle with practiced ease. The domestic scene felt surreal, as if they'd been sharing this space for years, instead of hours. Where did you come from? He asked, finally setting a plate before her. Before you came here? Nayeli's hands stilled. She set her sewing aside, eyes fixed on the plate. Far north? The Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Her gaze snapped up, sharp and wary. How you know I Cheyenne? Ethan hesitated. Your dress, the beadwork pattern. It wasn't a lie, though. It wasn't the whole truth either. He'd encountered enough tribes during his scouting days to recognize the distinctive styles. But something in her reaction confirmed his earlier suspicion she was running from something specific, something dangerous. Yes, reservation. She picked up her fork, signaling an end to that line of questioning. Ethan didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some stories emerged only when the teller was ready, if ever. They ate in silence, the wind picking up again outside, whistling through the cabin's chinks, despite his best efforts at sealing them. After the meal, he checked her leg wound. The stitches were holding no signs of infection yet. As he rebandaged it, his fingers brushed against the military badge he'd removed, now sitting on the table. "This was in your wound," he said, holding it up. "7th Cavalry." Nayeli's body tensed, her eyes fixed on the metal insignia. "You know them." It wasn't a question. "I was a scout during the war," Ethan said carefully. "Not with the 7th, but I know of them." He paused, then added, "They have a reputation." "Killers," she said flatly. "They come to village, kill old ones, children." The raw pain in her voice cut through the cabin's warmth. Ethan set the badge down, unable to deny her accusation. The 7th Cavalry's campaigns against the Plains tribes had been brutal, often indiscriminate. "You were there?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "After. I find survivors." Ethan nodded, understanding more than she'd said. The badge in her wound hadn't been an accident. She'd encountered soldiers recently, and the encounter had gone badly. "They looking for me," she added, confirming his suspicion. "Man dead. They say I kill." The admission hung in the air between them. Ethan should have been alarmed. Harboring a fugitive accused of killing a soldier could mean his own death. Yet something in her steady gaze, in the dignity with which she carried her pain, made him doubt the official story. "Did you?" he asked simply. Nayeli held his gaze. "No, but better they think so." Ethan nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of war, of its aftermath, to know that truth was often the first casualty. And he'd learned to trust his instincts about people, instincts that told him this woman, whatever her secrets, wasn't lying about this. "You're safe here," he repeated his words from the night before. "At least until you're healed." The look she gave him was complex gratitude, mingled with disbelief, wariness, with hope. She retrieved her sewing, and they lapsed into silence again, each lost in private thoughts, as the afternoon waned. Later, as Ethan prepared to bank the fire for the night, he noticed Nayeli examining the small shelf where he kept his few personal items. Her fingers hovered over a daguerreotype in a simple frame. Margaret smiling faintly, her hair arranged in the fashion of a decade ago. "My wife," he said, the words still carrying an edge of pain, even after 4 years. "Margaret." "She is dead," Nayeli observed quietly. "Cholera, while I was away scouting." The familiar guilt twisted in his gut. "I didn't make it back in time." Nayeli nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My mother, father, brothers, all dead." She set the picture down gently. "Alone is hard way." The simple truth of her statement struck him more powerfully than any elaborate condolence could have. Ethan found himself nodding, a lump in his throat, preventing speech. "You sleep now," he said, finally gesturing to the bed. "I'll keep watch." Once again she hesitated, studying his face, as if searching for hidden intent. Then she moved to the bed, sitting on the edge to remove the oversized boots. The process was awkward, and Ethan found himself crossing the room to help. "Here," he said, kneeling to ease the boots from her feet. The gesture felt strangely intimate, though he kept his touch impersonal. "Thank you," she said softly, as he set the boots aside. He nodded, returning to his chair by the door. This time Nayeli lay down without further hesitation, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Her breathing evened out more quickly than the night before, exhaustion finally overcoming wariness. Ethan remained awake, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind. The cavalry badge sat on the table where he'd left it, a reminder of dangers beyond his homestead's boundaries. He'd made a choice in letting her stay, in believing her. Now he would have to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Ethan and Nayeli worked side by side, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and preparing for the next storm that the heavy clouds on the horizon promised. Her wound began to heal, and though she still limped, she matched him in work ethic, if not in strength. They spoke little, but the silences between them grew more comfortable. At night, she took the bed, while he kept his vigil in the chair, though he'd begun to doze more deeply, some instinct telling him she wouldn't flee or harm him in his sleep. On the fourth morning, Ethan woke to find Nayeli already up and cooking. She had mastered the temperamental stove and was frying cornmeal cakes in his cast-iron skillet. The domestic scene caught him off guard, a glimpse of what normal life might look like after years of solitude. "Smells good," he said, rising from the chair and stretching his stiff muscles. Nayeli glanced over her shoulder, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Better than your cooking." It was the first hint of humor she'd shown, and Ethan found himself chuckling despite his surprise. Not hard to manage that. They ate together at the small table, steam rising from their coffee mugs. Outside, the promised storm had arrived during the night, dumping fresh snow that now stood knee-deep around the cabin. "Need to check the north fence," Ethan said, peering through the frosted window. "Cattle might drift if it's down." Nayeli nodded, already rising to clear their plates. "I come too. Storm's bad. Your leg is better," she interrupted firmly. "I help." Ethan had learned not to argue when that tone entered her voice. They bundled up against the bitter cold, Nayeli, now wearing layers of his clothing, adapted to her smaller frame with clever tucks and ties. He'd given her his spare gloves and a scarf to wrap around her head, leaving only her eyes visible. The trek to the north fence was arduous. Wind-driven snow had created drifts taller than a man, in places forcing them to forge new paths. Nayeli moved with surprising agility, despite her injury sometimes leading the way where the snow was less deep. The fence, when they reached it, had indeed collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. Several cattle huddled nearby, dangerously close to wandering onto the open plain where wolves or the cold would claim them. "We need to drive them back," Ethan shouted over the wind, gesturing toward the animals. Nayeli nodded, understanding immediately. They split up, approaching the small herd from different angles. Ethan watched with admiration as she used her smaller size to advantage, darting between the cattle with quick, decisive movements that turned them toward safer ground. Once the animals were secure, they set to repairing the fence. Ethan handled the heavier posts, while Nayeli strung wire, her gloved fingers working deftly despite the cold. They worked in tandem, anticipating each other's needs without words. When the job was done, they paused, breathing hard vapor clouds forming with each exhale. Nayeli's eyes crinkled above her scarf. She was smiling, he realized, pleased with their accomplishment. The moment of shared satisfaction was broken by a sound carrying faintly on the wind. Hoofbeats. Approaching riders. Ethan tensed hand, moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. Visitors were rare in the best weather. In a snowstorm, they were unheard of unless they had urgent business. "Go back to the cabin," he told Nayeli, voice low and urgent. "Stay out of sight." Her eyes widened with understanding, then hardened with determination. Without a word, she turned and began making her way back toward the homestead, using their existing tracks to move swiftly, despite the deep snow. Ethan watched until she disappeared behind a rise, then turned to face the approaching riders. Through the swirling snow, he could make out 3 figures on horseback, moving steadily toward his property. He positioned himself by the repaired fence, hand resting casually near his weapon, and waited. The lead rider came into focus first, a tall man with a weathered face, partially hidden by a thick beard crusted with ice. He wore an army greatcoat with sergeant's stripes, though no other uniform was visible beneath his winter gear. The two men flanking him were younger, dressed as civilians, but armed with military carbines. "Afternoon," the leader called as they drew near. "Mighty rough weather for fence mending." "Cattle don't wait for fair skies," Ethan replied evenly. "What brings army men out in a storm?" The man's eyes narrowed slightly at Ethan's immediate identification of their military connection. "Sharp eye. Name's Blackwood. Marcus Blackwood. These are Harris and Doyle." He gestured to his companions. "We're looking for a fugitive. Indian woman. Cheyenne. Killed a lieutenant 3 days back at Fort Kearney." Ethan kept his expression neutral, despite the jolt of confirmation. "Haven't seen any Indians. Just me and the cattle out here." Blackwood studied him, gaze traveling from Ethan's face to the dual sets of tracks in the snow, one clearly smaller than the other. "2 sets of prints here." "My tracks from yesterday and today," Ethan lied smoothly, checking the fence line twice. The man's skepticism was evident, but he didn't challenge the explanation directly. "Mind if we warm up in your cabin? Horses could use a rest." It wasn't really a request. Refusing would only heighten their suspicions. "Follow me," Ethan said, turning toward the homestead. His mind raced, hoping Nayeli had made it back and hidden herself adequately. The last thing he needed was a confrontation with 3 armed men on his own property. The ride back to the cabin was tense, the soldiers following close behind. As they approached, Ethan scanned for any sign of Nayeli, but saw nothing amiss. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it that morning, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. "Cozy setup you have," Blackwood commented as they dismounted. "All alone out here." "Suits me," Ethan replied shortly, leading the horses to the sheltered side of the barn rather than inside where Nayeli might be hiding. Inside the cabin, the warmth was welcome after the biting cold. Ethan busied himself adding wood to the fire, acutely aware of the soldier's eyes scanning his sparse living quarters. There was no sign of Nayeli, no women's clothing visible, no extra plate on the table. She'd covered her tracks well. "Coffee," he offered, more out of frontier courtesy than genuine hospitality. "Wouldn't say no," Blackwood replied, settling himself in Ethan's chair without invitation. His companions remained standing, positioning themselves near the door and window, tactical placements that Ethan didn't miss. As he prepared the coffee, Ethan felt Blackwood's evaluating gaze on his back. "You military?" the sergeant asked. "Was. Scout for the Union, long time ago." "Thought so. You've got the look." Blackwood accepted the coffee mug Ethan handed him. "Which regiment?" "Moved around, mainly with the 2nd Colorado." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Saw action at Glorietta Pass." "Among other places." The seemingly casual conversation had purpose. Blackwood was establishing Ethan's background, looking for inconsistencies or lies. It was a technique Ethan recognized from interrogations during the war. "This Indian woman we're after," Blackwood continued, shifting topics abruptly. "Dangerous. Stabbed Lieutenant Reed while he slept. Took his sidearm." Ethan kept his face impassive. "Sounds serious." "Very. Sheriff's got a bounty on her, dead or alive. Preferably alive." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "She's got information we need." "About what?" "Renegade band. Northern Cheyenne causing trouble for settlers near the Bighorns. She's connected to their chief." Blackwood sipped his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. "Anyone passes through, you'll send word to Fort Kearney." "Of course," Ethan lied. "Don't get many visitors, though." "No," Blackwood's gaze drifted to the wash basin where a second cup sat drying. Seem to have company enough for extra dishes. Ethan's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. Had a trapper stay over 2 nights ago. Waited out the storm. Blackwood hummed noncommittally, rising from the chair. He moved around the small cabin with deliberate slowness, examining Ethan's few possessions. When he reached the bed, he paused, fingers brushing over the quilt. Nice stitching, he remarked. Your work. My late wife's. Blackwood nodded sympathy, flashing briefly across his hard features. Lost mine to influenza in '68. Harsh country for women. For a moment, the shared experience of loss created a tenuous connection between them. Then Blackwood's gaze hardened again, all trace of empathy vanishing. Well, we've imposed on your hospitality long enough. He gestured to his men. Best be moving on before the snow gets deeper. Relief washed through Ethan, carefully concealed. Safe travels. At the door, Blackwood paused, turning back with calculated casualness. Almost forgot. If you do see her. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Ethan. Description's there. Reward, too. Substantial. Ethan took the paper without opening it. I'll keep an eye out. You do that. Blackwood's eyes were cold. Though between us, veterans, if you find her, don't hesitate. These savages don't surrender peacefully. The thinly veiled suggestion turned Ethan's stomach, but he nodded as if in agreement. He watched from the doorway as the 3 men mounted up and rode away, waiting until they disappeared into the swirling snow before closing the door with a heavy sigh. They gone? Nayeli's voice from above startled him. Ethan looked up to find her peering down through the open trapdoor to the small attic space, a storage area he rarely used. Yes, you can come down. She descended the crude ladder with careful movements, dust clinging to her clothing and hair. The hiding place had been clever, few would think to look in a cramped attic during a casual search. You heard, he asked. Nayeli nodded, her expression grim. They lie. About Reed. Ethan unfolded the wanted poster. It described Nayeli as armed, dangerous, and responsible for the murder of Lieutenant James Reed of the 7th Cavalry. The reward was indeed substantial, $50 dead or alive. Tell me what really happened, he said, sitting at the table and gesturing for her to join him. Nayeli remained standing, arms crossed defensively across her chest. Why, you want? No, you give me to them for money. The question stung, though he understood her wariness. If I wanted the reward, I'd have handed you over just now. She studied him for a long moment, then sat across from him with a reluctant nod. Lieutenant Reed. She began speaking his name with barely disguised contempt. He lead attack on my people's village. Last spring. Not battle. Murder. She described a dawn raid on a peaceful encampment, soldiers firing indiscriminately into teepees where families slept. Her parents, 3 brothers, and many others had been killed. Nayeli had been away gathering medicinal plants in the hills. She'd returned to find her home destroyed, her people massacred. I find survivors. Help them. We go north to relatives. Her voice remained steady, though pain shadowed her eyes. 3 days ago, hunting party find Reed, 2 others. Separated from patrol. My brother, he recognized Reed. Want revenge. Your brother killed Reed, Ethan asked quietly. Nayeli nodded. I try stop him. Too much blood already. But Reed he see me, know me from village. He shoot at me. She touched her leg where the wound was healing. Badge tear my skin when I fall. Brother kill Reed then. Others run. But the soldiers think you did it. Better they think woman alone than hunting party, she said simply, safer for others. The sacrifice struck Ethan deeply, Nayeli deliberately drawing pursuit to herself, away from her remaining family and the survivors she'd helped. It explained why she'd traveled so far south, why she'd risked approaching a white settler's cabin in desperation. "That man Blackwood," she continued, "he was there too, at village. He know me. If he see me," the implication was clear. Blackwood hadn't just been following orders and searching for her. He had personal reasons to ensure she never spoke about what had happened at the village. "He won't find you here," Ethan said with quiet determination. "But we need to be more careful. They'll be watching now." Nayeli's brow furrowed. "Why you help me risk for stranger?" It was a question Ethan had been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to let her stay. The answer came to him with unexpected clarity. "Because I've seen enough injustice in war to last lifetimes," he said slowly. "And because sometimes the only honorable choice is the dangerous one." Something shifted in Nayeli's expression, a softening, a tentative trust. She reached across the table, her slender fingers coming to rest lightly on his wrist. "Thank you," she said simply, the words weighted with a gratitude that transcended language. Ethan nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. He rose, moving to the stove to reheat the coffee. "We should check the other fences tomorrow, if weather allows." "Yes," she agreed, accepting his retreat to practical matters. "I fix more things too. Earn keep." That night, as snow continued to fall outside, Ethan took his usual position in the chair by the door. But something had changed. The wanted poster lay on the table between them, a tangible reminder of the danger that now bound them together. Harboring Nayeli had moved beyond simple charity or decency. It was now a deliberate stand against an injustice he couldn't ignore. As Nayeli settled onto the bed, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, she looked toward him with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Ethan," she said softly, "you not sleep well in chair, always watch door." "It's fine," he assured her. "I'm used to it." She shook her head slightly. "Not good. You need rest too." She patted the far side of the narrow bed. "Big enough. I stay on side." The offer startled him. In the dim light, he could see no suggestion of the earlier proposition she'd made upon arrival, only practical concern. "I don't think—" "For sleep," she clarified firmly. "Only sleep. You save my life. I want you strong." Put that way, her logic was hard to refute. Ethan's back and neck had been protesting the nightly chair vigil with increasing vehemence, and something in her steady gaze told him the offer was genuinely without ulterior motive. "All right," he conceded, setting his rifle within easy reach of the bed before removing his boots. He lay down on the far edge of the mattress, maintaining a careful distance between them. Nayeli remained equally distant on her side, respecting the invisible boundary between them. The arrangement was practical, nothing more, yet Ethan found himself acutely aware of her presence, the soft sound of her breathing, the faint scent of pine smoke in her hair. "Good night, Nayeli," he said quietly. "Good sleep, Ethan," she replied, her voice already heavy with approaching slumber. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin's corners, snow piling ever deeper against its walls. But inside, something new had taken root. A fragile trust, a tentative alliance against common enemies. As Ethan drifted toward sleep, more comfortable than he'd been in days, he wondered what Margaret would think of the strange turn his solitary life had taken. For the first time in years, he dreamed not of battlefields or loss, but of spring of melting snow and green shoots pushing through damp earth. Of beginnings rather than endings. The dream shattered in the dark hours before dawn. Ethan jolted awake, disoriented, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to his consciousness. He'd been back in the war, watching helplessly as his patrol was ambushed, men he'd led, falling one by one while he survived. "No, no, no," he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cabin's chill. A hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. "Ethan, wake. Bad dream only." Nayeli's voice anchored him to the present. He blinked in the darkness, the familiar shapes of his cabin gradually replacing the blood-soaked forest of his dream. She was sitting up beside him, concern evident even in the dim light. "Sorry," he managed, embarrassed by his vulnerability. "Old ghosts. I know ghosts," she said simply. "They loud sometimes." The understanding in her voice required no elaboration. She'd seen her share of horrors, carried her own weight of survivor's guilt. Without another word, she lay back down, but her hand remained on his arm, a tether to the present, a reminder that he wasn't alone with his demons. Ethan's breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadying. For the first time in years, someone else knew of his nightmares, had witnessed his weakness without judgment. The realization was both terrifying and oddly freeing. Eventually, sleep reclaimed him, Nayeli's hand still resting lightly on his arm. When morning came, neither mentioned the night's events, but something had shifted between them, a deepening of understanding that transcended words. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Brilliant sunshine reflected off pristine snow, the world washed clean and dazzling. After breakfast, they ventured out to check on the animals and clear paths to the barn and corral. As they worked, Ethan found himself watching Nayeli more than necessary. She moved with increased confidence, now her limp less pronounced, her actions more assured. The oversized clothing she wore had been cleverly modified, cuffs turned and stitched, waistband gathered to fit her smaller frame. She'd adapted just as she'd adapted to everything life had thrown at her. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze, as they carried armfuls of firewood back to the cabin. "Nothing," he replied, embarrassed at being caught staring. Then, more honestly, "You're healing well." She nodded, shifting the wood in her arms. "Strong blood. My grandmother, she lived to see 90 winters. Very tough. Sounds like someone I'd have liked to meet." "She not like you," Nayeli said with unexpected humor. "She hate all white men, spit when they pass." Ethan chuckled despite himself. "Fair enough." Inside, they stacked the firewood neatly by the stove. The domestic routine they'd established over the past days felt increasingly natural, their movements in the small space choreographed to avoid collision, yet work in tandem. As Nayeli hung her borrowed coat by the door, Ethan noticed her pause, attention caught by something outside the window. He moved to her side, following her gaze. A rider approached along the track from town, still distant, but moving steadily through the snow. Not Blackwood or his men, this was a solitary figure on a dappled gray horse Ethan recognized immediately. "Dr. Walker," he said, relieved, "from town. He visits every few months, brings mail supplies." Nayeli tensed beside him. "He see me. He's a friend," Ethan assured her, though friend might be stretching the truth. Samuel Walker had been a field surgeon during the war, serving in the same regiment as Ethan for a time. They shared the bond of survivors, though they rarely spoke of those days now. "You trust?" Nayeli asked, eyes still fixed on the approaching rider. It was a fair question, one Ethan considered carefully before answering. "Yes, he's a good man, honest." She nodded slowly. "I hide anyway. Better safe." "No," Ethan decided. "No more hiding. You're here as my helper, working for room and board while you recover from an accident. Nothing suspicious about that." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by wariness. Why risk? Because hiding makes you look guilty, and because we might need allies. He picked up the wanted poster from the table, folding it and tucking it inside a book on the shelf. Follow my lead. Dr. Walker arrived minutes later, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man unaccustomed to long rides. In his 50s, with a salt and pepper beard and wire-rimmed spectacles, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much suffering to be easily shocked. "Ethan," he called, raising a gloved hand in greeting. "Thought you might need supplies after that storm." "Appreciate it, Doc," Ethan replied, stepping onto the porch. "Come in and warm up." Walker's eyebrows rose slightly as he entered the cabin and saw Nayeli standing by the stove. She had straightened her borrowed clothes as best she could and pulled her long black hair back with a strip of leather. "I see you have company," the doctor observed, his tone neutral but curious. "This is Nayeli," Ethan said smoothly. "She's been helping around the place since the first storm. Had an accident on the trail, wound on her leg, needed tending." Walker nodded politely to Nayeli, who returned the gesture with cautious dignity. "A pleasure, miss. I'm Dr. Samuel Walker from Cedar Creek." "Doctor," she acknowledged, her accent more pronounced than usual, a deliberate choice Ethan suspected to reinforce her outsider status. "I was about to make coffee," Ethan said. "Join us. Gladly." Walker removed his coat and gloves, hanging them by the door. "It's bitter out there, though. The road to town should be passable by tomorrow." As Ethan busied himself with the coffee, Walker seated himself at the table, medical instincts apparently triggered by the mention of an injury. "This accident, perhaps I could take a look at the wound I've brought my bag." Nayeli glanced at Ethan, who gave a subtle nod. Having a doctor examine her leg would reinforce their story, and Walker's discretion was trustworthy. "Thank you," she said, sitting across from the doctor and carefully rolling up the trouser leg to reveal Ethan's neat stitching. Walker leaned forward, examining the wound with professional detachment. "Clean work," he commented, looking up at Ethan. "Your handiwork, field medicine, not much forgotten." "Indeed," Walker gently probed the healing gash. "No infection, healing nicely." He glanced at Nayeli. "Any pain, fever?" She shook her head. "No fever. Pain less each day." "Good. Keep it clean, and those stitches can come out in another week." Walker accepted the coffee Ethan offered, warming his hands around the mug. "You're fortunate Mr. Sawyer has steady hands. Many would have made a mess of it." Nayeli's eyes met Ethan's briefly. "Yes, very fortunate." The conversation shifted to town news as they drank their coffee. Walker mentioned supplies he'd brought, coffee flour, salt, ammunition, essentials that would have required Ethan to make the dangerous journey to town otherwise. Ethan thanked him, offering dried venison and a wolf pelt in trade. "Nearly forgot," Walker said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Mail came through before the storm. Letter for you." Ethan accepted the envelope with surprise. He rarely received correspondence. The return address showed the Veterans Bureau in Washington, likely regarding his modest pension from his scouting days. "And news?" Walker continued, voice lowering slightly. "Army patrol came through town yesterday, looking for a Cheyenne woman. Fugitive, they said. Killed an officer." Ethan kept his expression neutral, though he felt Nayeli stiffen beside him. "We heard. 3 riders stopped by, asked if I'd seen anything." Walker's shrewd eyes moved between them, taking in details that his casual manner belied. "Sheriff Holt seemed eager to assist them, posted rewards all over town." "Holt never could resist a bounty," Ethan remarked, carefully gauging the doctor's reaction. "Did they say what this woman did, besides killing an officer?" Walker's gaze sharpened. Officially, no, but I overheard the Sergeant Blackwood, I believe, mentioning Fort Kearney and something about silencing witnesses. He sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving Ethan's face. Curious choice of words. The implication was clear. Walker had picked up on something suspicious about the Army's pursuit and was subtly conveying his doubts. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude for the doctor's perceptiveness. Curious indeed, he agreed mildly. Walker set down his empty cup and rose. Well, I should be on my way. Want to reach town before dark. He collected his coat and gloves, then paused, looking directly at Nayeli. Miss, whatever accident brought you here, I hope you heal quickly and find whatever you're seeking. The deliberate emphasis on accident confirmed Ethan's suspicion Walker had guessed more than he was saying. Nayeli inclined her head, understanding the subtle message. Thank you, Doctor, she said quietly, for all help. At the door, Walker turned to Ethan. The supply wagon comes through next week. Might be a good time to visit town stock up properly. His eyes conveyed a deeper meaning. Sheriff Holt usually rides circuit those days. Takes him far from Cedar Creek. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan replied, grateful for the veiled information. As the doctor rode away, Ethan and Nayeli stood in the doorway, watching until he disappeared over the rise. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow. He knows, Nayeli said, not a question. He suspects, Ethan corrected, but he won't betray us. How you sure? Ethan considered the question, remembering battlefield hospitals, the quiet dignity with which Walker had treated all wounded, regardless of rank or race. Because he's a healer first. Saw too much death in the war to help cause more now. Nayeli accepted this with a thoughtful nod. They returned inside, closing the door against the growing cold. As they prepared a simple supper, the domesticity of their actions stood in stark contrast to the danger that surrounded them. Two fugitives, one from justice, one from solitude, finding unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. Later, as darkness fell, they sat before the fire. Ethan opened the letter Walker had delivered, scanning its contents with a frown. Bad news, Nayeli asked, noticing his expression. The Veterans Bureau wants me to testify about an incident during the war, he explained, folding the letter. A night patrol that went wrong. I was the only survivor. You go. Ethan shook his head. Can't. It's in Washington months from now. He stared into the fire, old memories stirring. Wouldn't help anyway. Some things are better left buried. Nayeli's gaze was perceptive. Things that follow in dreams. He looked up, startled by her insight. Yes. She nodded, understanding, without need for elaboration. My people say dreams are spirits talking. Maybe they want peace too. The simple wisdom in her words resonated more deeply than any conventional comfort could have. Ethan found himself nodding, something tight in his chest, easing slightly. As they prepared for sleep, the routine now familiar, Ethan found himself watching Nayeli move about the cabin. Her gestures more relaxed, her presence filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. She had brought danger to his door. Yes, but also something else. Something he'd forgotten how to name. That night, as they lay side by side in the narrow bed, Ethan broke their customary silence. Why did you come here to my cabin specifically? Nayeli was quiet so long he thought she might have fallen asleep. Finally she answered, her voice soft in the darkness. I see smoke from hills. Watch 3 days. See one man only. Alone like me. She shifted slightly, turning toward him, though they remained apart. When soldiers chase, I think maybe lone man understand alone. Maybe help, not harm. A gamble, Ethan observed. Yes, the word hung between them, weighted with all that had followed from that desperate choice. Good gamble. Ethan found himself reaching across the space between them, his hand finding hers beneath the quilt. Her fingers were warm, smaller than his, but strong, calloused from work and survival. She didn't pull away. Good gamble, he agreed quietly. They fell asleep like that, hands linked in the darkness, while outside the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding beneath their cold light. In the morning, they would face whatever came next. But for now, in this moment, there was only the warmth of the cabin, the sound of breathing, and the tentative connection of two souls who had expected to remain forever alone. The week following Dr. Walker's visit settled into a rhythm of work and cautious companionship. Ethan and Nayeli fell into complementary roles around the homestead, he handling the heavier tasks, she bringing an unexpected efficiency to daily chores. The small cabin, once merely a shelter, began to feel like something more. On the morning of the 7th day, Ethan woke to find Nayeli already dressed and stoking the fire. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the frosted windows, creating patterns on the rough-hewn floor. Outside, the temperature had risen enough that the snow had begun to compact, the first hint that winter's grip might eventually loosen. "Need to go to town," Ethan said over breakfast, watching Nayeli's reaction carefully. "Supplies won't last another week." She tensed slightly, though her face remained impassive. "You go alone. Safer that way." He took a sip of coffee, considering his next words. "Walker said the supply wagon comes through today. Sheriff will be away on his circuit route." Nayeli nodded, understanding the implication. "Good time. I'll be back before dark." Ethan hesitated, then added, "Anyone comes while I'm gone, I hide," she finished for him. "Use rifle if needed." The matter-of-fact way she referenced potential violence reminded Ethan that beneath her quiet demeanor lay a survivor's resolve. She had already endured more than most could imagine, had already demonstrated her willingness to sacrifice for those she protected. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he said, rising to clear his plate. As he prepared for the journey to Cedar Creek, Ethan found himself oddly reluctant to leave. The routine they'd established felt suddenly precious, fragile, a momentary peace that the outside world threatened to shatter. Nayeli seemed to sense his unease, accompanying him to the barn to help saddle Rusty. "I worry," she admitted, as he tightened the cinch, her voice low. "Blackwood, he's smart. Maybe watch town." "I'll be careful," Ethan promised. "Just a quick trip, in and out." She reached up unexpectedly, straightening the collar of his coat with a gesture that felt startlingly intimate. "Be safe," she said simply. Ethan nodded momentarily, unable to speak. As he mounted and turned Rusty toward the trail, he looked back once. Nayeli stood in the barnyard, her borrowed clothes flapping in the breeze, a solitary figure against the vast white landscape. She raised a hand in farewell, and he returned the gesture before urging his horse forward. The ride to Cedar Creek took nearly 2 hours, the trail still partially obscured by drifting snow. Ethan remained vigilant, eyes scanning the rolling hills for any sign of riders or danger. But the journey passed uneventfully, the only sounds the rhythmic crunch of Rusty's hooves and the occasional cry of a hunting hawk overhead. Cedar Creek emerged from behind a rise, a small frontier town consisting of one main street flanked by wooden buildings in various states of repair. A church steeple rose at one end. A saloon's weathered sign hung at the other, with the necessities of frontier life arranged between general store, blacksmith, doctor's office, sheriff's station. Perhaps 200 souls called it home, most eking out hard-scrabble livings on surrounding homesteads and ranches. Ethan rode directly to Miller's general store, dismounting and tethering Rusty to the hitching post out front. The familiar bell jingled as he pushed open the door, warmth and the sense of coffee leather and dried goods enveloping him. Florence Miller looked up from behind the counter, her stern features softening slightly at the sight of him. A widow in her 50s, she ran the store with brisk efficiency and knew the business of everyone in the county, though she was selective about what she shared and with whom. "Ethan Sawyer," she said, setting aside the ledger she'd been reviewing. "Twice in one winter. Must be a record." "Mrs. Miller?" he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Dr. Walker said the supply wagon came through." "Yesterday afternoon." She studied him with shrewd eyes. "Walker mentioned you might be in. Said you had company out at your place." News traveled fast in small communities. Ethan kept his expression neutral. "Just someone passing through. Helped with repairs after the storms." Florence's arched eyebrow conveyed her skepticism, but she didn't press. "What do you need today?" Ethan handed over his list: coffee flour, sugar, salt, ammunition, lamp oil, and a few other necessities. As Florence moved efficiently around the store gathering the items, the bell jangled again. Ethan turned to see Thomas Green, the town's blacksmith, enter, stamping snow from his boots. "Sawyer," Green greeted with a nod. "Heard you took down that big gray wolf that's been killing stock all winter." "News travels," Ethan commented dryly. "Walker mentioned it." Green hung his coat on a peg by the door. "Said it near took a chunk out of you in the process. Just a scratch. Still got the pelt." "Trading it to Walker for supplies." Green nodded approvingly. "Fair deal. That wolf cost Jensen 3 calves and Morley a horse. You did the whole county a service." The conversation continued in the laconic style of men who valued actions over words. Green inquired about Ethan's fences, mentioned a new technique for treating fence posts against rot, commented on the weather. Normal mundane topics that nevertheless provided Ethan with a strange comfort, a reminder of a simpler life beyond the complications that had entered his. Florence returned with his supplies bundled and ready. "That'll be $3.45, she said, "unless you're trading today." Ethan counted out the money, the coins representing a significant portion of his meager savings. "Anything I should know about?" he asked casually as she made change. "Been away from town a while?" Florence's eyes darted briefly to Green, then back to Ethan. "Sheriff's been busy. Army men came through, posted notices about some Indian fugitive." Her voice lowered slightly. "Been some disagreement about it. Reverend Simmons says we should offer sanctuary to any soul in need. Sheriff says the law's the law." "And what do you say, Mrs. Miller?" Ethan asked, curious, despite himself. She fixed him with a level gaze. "I say a person ought to know the whole story before passing judgment, especially when it comes to army business these days." The statement, carefully neutral on its surface, carried undercurrents that Ethan understood immediately. Florence had lost her husband at Shiloh, had seen firsthand the way official reports could differ from bloody reality. "Wise perspective," he commented, gathering his purchases. As he loaded the supplies onto Rusty, Ethan felt a prickling sensation between his shoulder blades, the familiar awareness of being watched. He turned casually, scanning the street while adjusting his saddlebags. Nothing seemed amiss. A few townspeople moved about their business, paying him little mind. The sheriff's office remained closed, confirming Walker's information about Holt's absence. Yet the sensation persisted. Ethan mounted Rusty and turned him toward the trail home, maintaining an unhurried pace until he cleared the town limits. Only then did he allow himself a backward glance. The road behind him remained empty, the town peaceful in the afternoon light. Perhaps his nerves were simply raw, from the constant vigilance of recent days. Or perhaps a flicker of movement caught his eye. A rider emerging from behind the livery stable, then another. Two men keeping their distance, but clearly following his trail. Ethan urged Rusty into a trot, mind racing. Not Blackwood, and his men, these riders wore civilian clothing. Local men possibly hired to watch for strangers. Or bounty hunters, drawn by the reward. Either way, they represented danger. The trail home offered little cover, mostly open country with occasional stands of pine and rocky outcroppings. Ethan considered his options. Making a run for it would only confirm their suspicions, and Rusty, while sturdy, wasn't built for speed. Fighting would mean bloodshed, possibly his own. That left cunning. He maintained his pace for another mile, then veered off the main trail toward a creek that ran through a narrow ravine. The detour appeared natural, a traveler stopping for water before continuing his journey. Ethan dismounted at the creek's edge, letting Rusty drink while he scanned his surroundings. The riders had stopped at the top of the rise, watching. They hadn't expected him to leave the trail, were now conferring on how to proceed. Ethan used their hesitation to his advantage, leading Rusty down into the ravine where the creek cut between steep banks. Water would leave no tracks. Moving quickly now, he led his horse downstream, the frigid water numbing his boots as they splashed through the shallow current. After a quarter-mile, he found what he sought, a game trail leading up the opposite bank and into a stand of pines. From this vantage point, partially concealed by trees, Ethan could observe the ravine. Minutes later, the riders appeared, following his tracks to the creek's edge. They searched the banks in both directions, clearly frustrated by the disappearing trail. Eventually, they chose to follow the creek upstream, away from Ethan's position. He waited until they disappeared around a bend, then mounted and urged Rusty through the pines, emerging on the far side, where he could rejoin the trail home by a circuitous route. The maneuver would cost him time, but it would ensure he wasn't followed directly to his cabin to Nayeli. The detour added nearly an hour to his journey. By the time the familiar outline of his homestead appeared on the horizon, the winter sun was already sinking toward the western mountains. Shadows stretched long across the snow temperature, dropping as daylight faded. Ethan approached cautiously, scanning for any sign of disturbance. All appeared normal, smoke rising steadily from the chimney, no unexpected tracks in the snow around the cabin or barn. Still, he called out as he rode into the yard, not wanting to startle Nayeli. "It's Ethan," he announced, dismounting stiffly. His wet boots had frozen during the ride, leaving his feet numb and painful. The cabin door opened, and Nayeli emerged, relief evident on her face. "You late?" she said, concern rather than accusation in her voice. "Had to take the long way home," he explained, leading Rusty toward the barn. "We had company." Her expression sharpened. "Soldiers. Locals, I think, following me from town." Ethan began unsaddling Rusty, his cold fingers clumsy on the leather straps. "Lost them at the creek, but they'll keep looking." Nayeli took the saddle from him, noting his shivers. "Your feet wet. Come inside." In the cabin's warmth, Ethan discovered how thoroughly chilled he'd become. His hands trembled as he removed his frozen boots, his feet pale and dangerously numb. Nayeli took charge with quiet efficiency, guiding him to sit by the fire while she prepared a basin of lukewarm water. "Not hot," she explained, helping him immerse his feet. "Too fast warm is bad." The gradual return of feeling was exquisite agony. Ethan gritted his teeth against the pins and needles sensation, focusing instead on recounting his trip to town, Florence's subtle support, the posted notices, the men who had followed him. "Circle tightening," Nayeli observed grimly when he finished. "Yes," he agreed, "but slower than it might." Walker was right about the sheriff being away, and not everyone in town supports the Army's version of events. She considered this adding more lukewarm water to the basin. Good people there. Some. Mrs. Miller lost her husband in the war. She understands that official stories aren't always true ones. Nayeli nodded thoughtfully. My people say judge person by actions, not words. Words easy. Actions show true heart. The simple wisdom resonated with Ethan's own beliefs. Your people are right about that. Once his feet had regained normal color and feeling Nayeli helped him dry them, then insisted he remain by the fire while she unloaded the supplies he'd brought. There was something both strange and comforting about being cared for, a vulnerability Ethan had not allowed himself since Margaret's death. As they prepared dinner together, he found himself watching Nayeli more openly than before. She moved with natural grace. Despite her healing injury, her presence in his home no longer feeling like an intrusion, but rather an essential component. The realization unsettled him. What? She asked, catching his gaze as she stirred the pot of beans. Nothing, he replied automatically, then corrected himself. Just thinking how different things are from a week ago. She tilted her head slightly, considering. Better or worse? The question was disarmingly direct. Ethan found himself answering with equal honesty. Different, more complicated, but not worse. A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, softening the wariness that had become so familiar. Not worse, she agreed. Not simple, but not worse. That night, they sat by the fire after dinner, the cabin filled with comfortable silence. Ethan had brought back a newspaper from town, and he read sections aloud, mostly territorial news developments in Washington, updates on railroad progress. Nayeli listened attentively occasionally, asking questions about unfamiliar concepts or words. Your people, Ethan asked during a lull, where are they now, the ones who survived? Nayeli's expression grew distant. North, near mountains, with northern Cheyenne cousins. She traced a pattern on her knee. Safer there, for now. And your brother, the one who killed Reed. Swift Arrow. She spoke his name with a mixture of pride and concern. Strong warrior. Too angry sometimes. After attack, he want only revenge. Understandable, Ethan commented. She shook her head. Understand, yes, but wise no. Hate burns person who carries it, like holding hot coal to throw at enemy. The insight struck Ethan deeply, reminding him of his own years of smoldering anger after the war, after Margaret's death. How that anger had isolated him, driven him to this remote homestead, where human contact became rare enough to be uncomfortable. Is that why you tried to stop him when he killed Reed? Nayeli looked into the fire flames reflecting in her dark eyes. Partly. Also, she hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. Reed dead changes nothing. Parents still gone. Village still destroyed. But more blood brings more soldiers, more death. A cycle, Ethan murmured. Yes, cycle. She met his gaze directly. Hard to break, but must try. The conversation shifted to other topics, but the image stayed with Ethan, hate, as a burning coal scorching the hand that held it. He wondered if his years of solitude had been his own way of nursing such a coal, unwilling to release it, for fear of what might fill the empty space it left behind. Later, as they prepared for sleep, Ethan noticed Nayeli lingering by the window, staring out at the star-filled sky. Her profile in the dim light struck him with unexpected force. The straight line of her nose, the proud set of her chin, the intricate braid she'd woven into her long black hair. Nayeli, he said softly, the name still feeling new on his tongue. She turned the starlight, catching the planes of her face. Yes. What he'd intended to say vanished, replaced by a simpler question. Are you homesick? Surprise flickered across her features, followed by thoughtfulness. Home is, she gestured vaguely, not place only. People, ways, songs. Her voice softened. Yes, miss these things. Ethan nodded, understanding more than he could express. Home had once been Margaret, the life they'd planned together. After her death, he'd stopped thinking of anywhere as home. His cabin was shelter, nothing more. Until recently. We should sleep, he said, breaking the moment before it grew too weighted. Tomorrow we'll need to be extra vigilant. Nayeli moved away from the window, the spell of starlight broken. They settled into the bed that now accommodated them both with practiced ease, maintaining the respectful distance that had become habit. Yet something had shifted again between them, a deepening understanding perhaps, or a recognition of shared loneliness. Good night, Nayeli, Ethan said, extinguishing the lamp. Good dreams, Ethan, she replied softly in the darkness. The next morning dawned clear and bracingly cold. After breakfast, Ethan retrieved his spyglass from a trunk and spent time scanning the surrounding landscape from the cabin's small loft window. No sign of riders or movement beyond the natural stirrings of wildlife. We should be prepared, he told Nayeli as he descended the ladder. Those men yesterday will report back. They'll try again. She nodded, already gathering essential items, water-dried food, ammunition, and packing them into a small bundle. If we must run, she explained, seeing his questioning look. Smart, Ethan acknowledged, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. The day passed in heightened alertness. They took turns watching from different vantage points while completing necessary chores. By mid-afternoon, when no threat had materialized, Ethan began to wonder if he'd overestimated the danger. Then, Nayeli, returning from checking the horses, froze halfway across the yard. Riders, she said, voice low but urgent. From east. Ethan joined her, shading his eyes against the winter glare. 3 figures on horseback approached across the open plain, still distant, but moving steadily toward the homestead. Not the same men who had followed him from town, these riders moved with military precision, their silhouettes unmistakable even at a distance. Blackwood, Ethan muttered, and his men. Nayeli's face hardened, all trace of the previous night's openness vanishing behind a mask of wary determination. I go, she said decisively. Hide in hills, draw them away. No. Ethan's response was immediate and firm. That's what they want to separate us, chase you down in open country. He scanned the approaching riders again, estimating their arrival time. We stay together. In the cabin. They search again. Let them. Ethan's mind worked rapidly, calculating options. This time we'll be ready. Inside, he quickly explained his plan. Unlike the previous visit when Blackwood had caught them unprepared, they now had time to arrange the cabin precisely as they wanted it seen. Nayeli gathered her few personal items, the mended dress, the small pouch containing her belongings, and concealed them in the storage space beneath a loose floorboard under the bed. Ethan strategically placed items around the cabin, a single coffee mug on the table, his shaving kit left out, as if recently used, a book open beside the single chair. The scene they created was one of a man living alone, no evidence of a second occupant. But Ethan had no intention of hiding Nayeli this time. Instead, she changed into her original deerskin dress, now carefully mended, and loosened her hair to fall around her shoulders in the traditional style. You'll be here as a visitor, Ethan explained. Just arrived this morning asking for work. We've never met before today. Nayeli raised an eyebrow. They believe. Doesn't matter if they believe. What matters is they can't prove otherwise. He handed her a small knife which she concealed in the folds of her dress. "If things go wrong, run for the hills. I'll find you." She accepted the knife, but shook her head at his last instruction. "If fight comes, we fight together." Before Ethan could argue, the sound of approaching horses reached them. "Remember," he said urgently, "you just arrived. You know nothing about any fugitive or dead officer." Nayeli nodded, composing her features into a mask of cautious neutrality. Ethan moved to the door, hand resting near his holstered revolver, but not on it, alert but not overtly hostile. Blackwood and his two companions reined in before the cabin. The sergeant's gaze immediately fixed on Ethan, standing in the doorway, then shifted to take in the yard, the barn, the surrounding landscape. Ever the soldier assessing the terrain. "Sawyer," he called, dismounting with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to life in the saddle. "Thought we'd check back, see if you'd had any news about our fugitive." "None," Ethan replied evenly. "Been quiet out here." Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mind if we warm up again? Bitter wind today." "Help yourself." Ethan stepped aside, allowing the three men to enter. Their reaction to seeing Nayeli was immediate. The two younger soldiers tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. Blackwood's response was more controlled. A slight stiffening, a calculated narrowing of his eyes as he took in her appearance. "Well now," he said, false joviality coating his words. "Seems you've found yourself some company after all, Sawyer." Ethan maintained his calm demeanor. "This is Nayeli. Came by this morning looking for work, traveling north to join family." Nayeli inclined her head slightly in greeting, but remained silent, her posture conveying dignity rather than submission or fear. "That right?" Blackwood directed the question at her, his tone hardening. "Traveling alone?" "Yes," she answered simply, her accent more pronounced than usual. "Long journey." Blackwood exchanged glances with his men, a silent communication that raised the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from tense to dangerous. "Interesting timing," Blackwood remarked, removing his gloves deliberately. "Considering the weather, considering the fugitive we're hunting." He turned to Ethan. "Mighty coincidental, wouldn't you say, Cheyenne woman showing up on your doorstep?" Ethan shrugged, the gesture carefully casual. "Folks pass through, even in winter." "Folks pass through," Blackwood repeated, moving around the cabin with predatory slowness. "But they don't usually stay, do they? Unless they have reason to." One of the younger soldiers had positioned himself near the door, blocking the exit, Ethan noted with growing concern. The other remained near Blackwood, hand resting on his holstered revolver. "I've been hospitable, Sergeant," Ethan said, voice cooling. "Offered shelter twice now, but I'm starting to wonder about your interest in my affairs." Blackwood smiled thinly. "Just doing my duty, tracking a dangerous fugitive." He paused directly in front of Nayeli, studying her face. "Funny thing, though, this fugitive we're after, she matches your visitor's description up almost exactly." "Many Cheyenne women look similar to White Eyes," Nayeli observed, meeting his gaze steadily. "Perhaps." Blackwood's hand shot out suddenly, gripping her arm and turning it to expose the inside of her wrist. A small scar in the shape of a crescent moon marked the copper skin. "But not many have this particular mark, do they?" The atmosphere in the cabin crystallized into something lethal. Ethan's hand moved to his revolver, but the click of a hammer being cocked froze him in place. The younger soldier by the door had drawn his weapon, aiming it squarely at Ethan's chest. "I wouldn't," Blackwood advised coldly, still gripping Nayeli's arm. "Harris here was the territory's best marksman before joining my unit. Can put a bullet through a man's eye at 50 paces. Ethan remained motionless, mind racing through options that dwindled with each passing second. Nayeli stood rigid in Blackwood's grasp, her face betraying nothing despite what must have been a painful hold. "Now then," Blackwood continued, satisfaction evident in his tone, "let's dispense with the charade. This woman is a fugitive, wanted for the murder of Lieutenant James Reed. And you, Sawyer, are harboring her. That makes you an accomplice." "She didn't kill Reed," Ethan stated flatly. Blackwood's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh, and how would you know that, I wonder, unless she's been here longer than this morning?" The trap closed neatly around them. Deny knowledge of Reed's death, and he confirmed Nayeli had been staying with him. Admit knowledge, and he implicated himself as an accomplice. Ethan chose a third path. "I know because I know Reed's reputation," he said evenly. "And I know how the Army handles incidents involving Indians these days." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Careful, Sawyer. That sounds dangerously close to sedition." "It sounds like the truth," Ethan countered. "Which is what this is really about, isn't it? Not justice for Reed. Silencing witnesses." Something dangerous flashed in Blackwood's eyes. He released Nayeli's arm with a shove that sent her stumbling back against the table. "You've been listening to dangerous talk, Sawyer. The kind that got men court-martialed during the war. Or the kind that gets innocent people massacred after it." Ethan replied, the words escaping before he could temper them. The statement hung in the air, its implications clear. Blackwood's face flushed with anger, then settled into something colder, more calculating. "Harris Doyle," he ordered, "secure the prisoners. We're taking them back to Fort Kearny for questioning." The younger soldier near Blackwood moved toward Nayeli, reaching for his belt, where manacles hung. It was the opportunity Ethan had been waiting for, a moment of divided attention. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and fired. The shot wasn't aimed at any of the soldiers, but at the oil lamp hanging above the table. The glass shattered kerosene, spraying across the room and igniting instantly from the flame. Fire erupted between Blackwood and his men, momentarily blinding them. "Run!" Ethan shouted to Nayeli, diving toward the door where Harris stood, momentarily confused by the sudden chaos. Nayeli didn't hesitate. She snatched up the small bundle of emergency supplies she'd prepared and darted toward the door, the concealed knife now in her hand. As Harris raised his weapon, she slashed at his arm, opening a gash that caused him to drop the revolver with a cry of pain. Ethan shouldered past the wounded soldier, pulling Nayeli with him into the yard. Behind them, flames were already climbing the cabin's interior wall, and Blackwood's shouts mixed with the crackle of burning wood. "The horses," Ethan directed, leading her toward the barn at a run. Inside, they worked with desperate speed, Ethan saddling Rusty, while Nayeli prepared a second horse, a dun mare he kept as backup. The animals sensed their urgency, shifting nervously as they tightened cinches and secured saddlebags. "Which way?" Nayeli asked as they led the horses out the back of the barn, away from the burning cabin, where Blackwood and his men were still shouting, trying to control the rapidly spreading fire. "North," Ethan decided, helping her mount before swinging into his own saddle. "Toward the high country. They'll expect us to head for town." They rode hard, keeping to the shelter of a tree line that ran along the eastern edge of Ethan's property. Behind them, black smoke billowed into the winter sky, the cabin that had been Ethan's home for 4 years, now serving one final purpose as a diversion. Only when they reached the shelter of the foothills several miles from the homestead did they slow their pace. Ethan turned in his saddle, looking back at the distant plume of smoke. His expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of emotions passing behind his eyes. "I'm sorry," Nayeli said softly. "You're home." Ethan shook his head. "Just a cabin." He met her gaze, something resolute in his face. "We're alive. That's what matters." They pressed on, following game trails that wound ever higher into the hills. The terrain grew increasingly rugged pine forests, thickening around them snow deeper in the sheltered valleys. By nightfall, they had put significant distance between themselves and their pursuers, though Ethan knew Blackwood would not abandon the chase easily. "We need shelter," he said as darkness began to fall, the temperature dropping rapidly. "Can't risk a fire yet." Nayeli surveyed their surroundings with practiced eyes. There, she pointed to a rocky outcropping. "Might have cave. Animals use in winter." She was right. The outcropping concealed a shallow cave, not deep, but sufficient to shelter them and the horses from the biting wind. They unsaddled the animals, rubbing them down as best they could, before setting up their minimal camp in the deeper recesses of the cave. The bundle Nayeli had prepared contained jerky hardtack, a small pot matches wrapped in oilskin, and 2 blankets. Meager supplies, but enough to keep them alive in the short term. Ethan added his canteen and the few items he'd grabbed in their hasty departure ammunition, his skinning knife a compass. "No fire tonight," he decided reluctantly. "Too visible from below." Nayeli nodded in agreement, arranging the blankets to create pallets on the stone floor. The cave retained some heat, sheltered from the wind, but it would be a cold night nonetheless. As they ate a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack, Ethan found himself studying Nayeli in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. She sat cross-legged, her back straight, despite exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. Her composure in the face of their desperate flight impressed him anew. "You handled yourself well back there," he said finally. "With Harris." She glanced up, something like grim satisfaction crossing her features. "Not first fight." "I believe it." Ethan took a sip from his canteen. "Where did you learn to use a knife like that?" "My father teach all children, boys and girls. Say world dangerous, must be ready." She accepted the canteen when he passed it, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Your shot, very clever." With lamp, Ethan shrugged. "Desperate times." "But not first desperate time for you," she observed shrewdly. "No," he acknowledged. "Not the first." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional shifting of the horses at the cave entrance. Outside, night had fully descended, stars emerging in a sky of crystalline clarity. The moon, nearly full, cast silver light across the snow-covered landscape, beautiful and merciless in its indifference to human struggles. "What now?" Nayeli asked, eventually voicing the question that hung between them. Ethan considered their options none particularly promising. "Blackwood will organize a search, probably bring men from the fort. They'll expect us to either head for town or try to reach the Cheyenne territory to the north." "So we do neither," she concluded. "Exactly." Ethan traced a rough map in the dirt floor of the cave. "We're here in the eastern foothills. Town is southwest, Cheyenne territory far north. But if we head west into the high mountains, winter in mountains is death," Nayeli pointed out pragmatically. "Not if we find the right shelter. There's an old trapper's cabin near the western pass. Used it once during my scouting days. If it's still standing, it could hide us until spring thaw." Nayeli considered this, then nodded slowly. "How far?" 3 days' ride in good weather, longer in these conditions. And after, when spring comes, the question carried weight beyond its simple words. After. A future neither of them had dared contemplate in the urgency of survival. Ethan found himself without a ready answer. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "One step at a time. First, we survive winter." She accepted this with quiet dignity, turning her attention to arranging their meager belongings more efficiently. As she worked, a small object fell from a fold in her dress, a leather pouch worn smooth by handling. She retrieved it quickly, but not before Ethan glimpsed its contents, a carved wooden animal small enough to fit in a palm and what appeared to be a braided lock of hair. Seeing his notice, Nayeli hesitated, then held out the pouch. "From my mother," she explained. "Last thing she give me." Before Ethan understood the significance without elaboration. He accepted the pouch, carefully examining the small carving, a horse he realized rendered with simple but expressive lines. "She make for me when small," Nayeli continued. "Say horse spirit guide me. Keep safe on journeys." "It's beautiful," Ethan said sincerely, returning the pouch. "Your mother was skilled." "Yes." Nayeli's voice softened with memory. "She teach me many things. Plants for healing, stars for direction, stories of ancestors." She secured the pouch inside her dress once more. "All I have now of her." The moment of sharing seemed to deepen the connection between them. Two people who carried the weight of lost loved ones, who understood grief as a constant companion rather than a passing visitor. As the temperature continued to drop, they were forced by necessity to move closer together, sharing body heat beneath the blankets. Unlike in the cabin where habit had maintained a respectful distance between them, here survival required proximity. Ethan found himself acutely aware of Nayeli's presence beside him, the rhythm of her breathing, the subtle warmth of her body, the faint scent of pine smoke in her hair. "Sleep," she murmured, sensing his wakefulness. "Long ride tomorrow." Ethan nodded in the darkness, willing his mind to quiet. Yet, as exhaustion finally pulled him toward slumber, he found himself wondering if the true danger they faced wasn't Blackwood and his men, but rather this growing connection, this fragile bridge forming between two worlds that history insisted must remain separate. Morning arrived with a sky heavy with fresh snow. Ethan woke stiff from the hard ground but surprisingly rested. Nayeli was already up, standing at the cave entrance, watching the valley below through his spyglass. She turned as he approached, handing him the glass without comment. Through the lens, Ethan could see what had captured her attention: riders, at least 6 of them, moving in a search pattern across the lower slopes. Blackwood had indeed organized a larger party, and they were methodically combing the area. "We need to move," he said, collapsing the spyglass. "They'll reach these foothills by midday." They packed quickly, saddling the horses and obliterating any signs of their presence as best they could. The sky continued to darken, heavy clouds rolling in from the west, a blessing in disguise, as fresh snowfall would cover their tracks. Ethan led them higher into the mountains, following game trails when possible, breaking trail through deep snow when necessary. The going was slow, each mile hard-won against the elements and terrain. By mid-morning, snow began to fall lightly, at first then, with increasing intensity as the wind rose. "Storm coming," Nayeli observed, pulling her scarf tighter around her face. "Big one." Ethan nodded grimly. A blizzard would conceal their passage, but could also kill them if they became disoriented or trapped in the open. He studied the landscape ahead, searching for landmarks half-remembered from years before. "There should be a river canyon about 2 miles ahead," he said. "If we can reach it, it'll provide some shelter from the wind." They pressed on the horses, laboring through deepening snow. The storm intensified with alarming speed, visibility decreasing until they could see barely 20 yards ahead. Wind howled around them, driving snow into any exposed skin with needle-like precision. Ethan dismounted to lead Rusty through a particularly treacherous section, the ground falling away steeply on one side. Nayeli followed suit, her smaller frame struggling against the force of the wind. They moved in single file, each step carefully placed in the increasingly treacherous conditions. The canyon appeared suddenly through the curtain of snow, a dark gash in the white landscape. Ethan felt a surge of relief as they descended into its relative shelter, the worst of the wind blocked by the high walls of stone. The river at its bottom ran swift and dark between ice-crusted banks, the sound of rushing water nearly lost beneath the storm's fury. "We'll follow the canyon," Ethan shouted over the wind. "It runs roughly west, should lead us toward the pass." Nayeli nodded, her face barely visible beneath layers of scarves and snow. They remounted, following the narrow trail that skirted the canyon's edge. The path was dangerous, slick with ice, and occasionally broken by rock falls, but still preferable to the exposed mountainside above. For hours they pressed on, speaking little, conserving energy for the grueling journey. The storm showed no signs of abating, snow accumulating at an alarming rate. Twice they were forced to dismount and clear a path where drifts had completely obscured the trail. By late afternoon, with daylight already fading in the storm's gloom, Ethan realized they would not reach suitable shelter before nightfall. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and even their layers of clothing wouldn't protect them through the night in the open. "We need to find shelter now," he called back to Nayeli. "Can't continue in the dark." She pointed toward a dark recess in the canyon wall ahead, not a proper cave, but an overhang deep enough to offer some protection. They made for it gratefully, the horses as eager as their riders for respite from the relentless storm. The overhang proved better than it had appeared from a distance. Its depth extended nearly 15 feet into the cliff face, and previous travelers had constructed a crude windbreak of stones and branches at its mouth. Inside, the ground was relatively dry, protected from snow by the rock ceiling above. They unsaddled the exhausted horses, rubbing them down with handfuls of dry grass they found tucked in crevices of the rock left by previous occupants, perhaps, or by animals seeking shelter. The beasts settled against the back wall, their large bodies providing welcome warmth in the confined space. "Can risk small fire here," Nayeli suggested, gesturing to a blackened spot on the stone floor, where others had clearly done the same. "Storm hide smoke. Need warmth." Ethan agreed, grateful for her practical knowledge. Together, they gathered what fuel they could find: dead branches trapped in rock falls along the canyon edge, dried grass, a few pine cones. Not enough for a sustained blaze, but sufficient for a small cooking fire. With practiced efficiency, Nayeli arranged the fuel while Ethan struck a match, sheltering the precious flame from drafts until it caught the tinder. The small fire cast welcome light and heat in their stone shelter, though they would need to be frugal with their limited fuel. Nayeli melted snow in the small pot, adding jerky to create a simple but hot broth. They ate in silence, savoring the warmth that spread through their bodies. Outside, the storm continued, unabated snow piling against the stone windbreak and occasionally gusting into their shelter despite it. "Will they follow?" Nayeli asked, finally nodding toward the storm. In this, Ethan considered the question, warming his hands over the small flame. "Not in the blizzard, but Blackwood won't give up. Once it passes, they'll pick up our trail if they can." "Why?" The question held genuine puzzlement. One woman. Why so important? It was something Ethan had been pondering himself. The resources devoted to capturing a single Cheyenne woman accused of killing an officer seemed disproportionate, even considering the Army's harsh policies toward Indian resistance. "I don't think it's just about Reed's death," he said slowly. "Blackwood's too determined. This feels personal." Nayeli's expression darkened. "At village attack, Blackwood there, with Reed." "You recognized him?" Ethan asked, surprised she hadn't mentioned this earlier. She nodded, eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Not forget such face. He enjoy killing." Her voice lowered. "Some soldiers not want fight. Follow orders only. Blackwood, different. He hunt people like animals. The description aligned with Ethan's own impression of the sergeant, a man who found satisfaction in dominance and violence. Such men existed in every army, their natural cruelty given license by war's chaos. That might explain his determination, Ethan mused, if you can identify him as participating in a massacre of civilians. More than participate, Nayeli said quietly. He lead second attack. When people flee, village run to river. Blackwood follow. Kill women, children, trying to cross water. The revelation settled heavily between them. Not just a participant, but an active leader in atrocities that could, if exposed, end his military career, or worse. Ethan understood now why Blackwood pursued Nayeli with such vigor. She represented a threat to everything he had built. Did Reed lead the initial attack? He asked, pieces falling into place. Yes, but Reed follow orders. Blackwood, she struggled for the English words. Blackwood go beyond, take pleasure. And now he needs to silence any witnesses, Ethan concluded grimly. Starting with you. The fire crackled between them, shadows dancing across the stone walls of their shelter. Outside, the storm's howl provided a fitting accompaniment to the dark revelations they shared. What about your brother? Ethan asked after a contemplative silence. Swift Arrow. Is he safe? Don't know, Nayeli admitted, worry creasing her brow. After Reed die, we separate. He go with others to North Country. I draw soldiers away. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks upward. Hope he reach safety, but can't know. The selflessness of her actions struck Ethan anew, deliberately drawing danger to herself to protect others, abandoning safety and community for the slim chance of saving her brother and her people. It was a courage beyond mere bravery, a sacrifice made without expectation of reward or recognition. We'll find a way to send word, he promised. When it's safer. Let him know you're alive. Nayeli looked up, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. Why you help me, Ethan, risk everything? Lose home. For stranger. It was the question she'd asked before, but now it carried new weight, demanded a more honest answer than he'd previously given. Ethan stared into the small flames, searching for words to express what he himself didn't fully understand. When you appeared at my door, he began slowly. I thought you were just someone needing help. Then you became someone I respected, someone who'd survived horrors I could barely imagine, yet kept her dignity, her humanity. He met her gaze across the fire. And now you're not a stranger at all. The simple truth hung in the air between them, its implications both profound and frightening. Nayeli held his gaze, something softening in her expression. Not stranger, she agreed quietly. Not anymore. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then, with practiced pragmatism, Nayeli turned to banking the fire, preserving coals for morning. Should sleep, need strength tomorrow. They arranged their blankets near the fire's dying warmth necessity, once again bringing them close together against the bitter cold. This time, however, the proximity felt different, a choice rather than mere survival. As they settled beneath the shared blankets, Nayeli's head came to rest against Ethan's shoulder, fitting there as if designed for that purpose. Is this all right? He asked quietly, arm hesitantly encircling her. She nodded against his shoulder, the simple movement conveying more than words could have. They lay together, listening to the storm's fury outside their shelter, finding in each other's presence a warmth that defied the winter's bitter cold. Just before sleep claimed him, Ethan felt Nayeli's hand find his beneath the blankets. Her fingers interlaced with his, the gesture innocent yet intimate in its trust. He tightened his grip slightly, offering silent reassurance, and felt her relax against him. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, whatever challenges lay ahead on their journey, this moment, this connection felt like something worth fighting for, something worth preserving against all odds. Outside, the blizzard raged on, erasing their tracks from the mountainside, concealing their passage from those who wished them harm. Nature, indifferent to human concerns, had granted them a temporary reprieve. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. But for now, in their stone shelter above the frozen canyon, Ethan and Nayeli had found something neither had expected in their desperate flight, not just safety, but a fragile beginning. A tentative trust that, like the small fire they'd kindled from sparse materials, might yet grow into something strong enough to withstand the storm. Dawn arrived as a gradual lightening of shadows rather than a true sunrise. The blizzard had weakened overnight, but still shrouded the mountains in swirling snow. Ethan woke, with Nayeli still nestled against him, her breathing deep and even. For a moment, he allowed himself to remain still, reluctant to break the peaceful interlude. Reality, however, would not be denied. Their situation remained desperate: minimal supplies, hostile pursuers, and the merciless winter of the high country all conspired against them. With careful movements to avoid waking Nayeli, Ethan extricated himself and moved to the entrance of their stone shelter. The storm had transformed the landscape. Snow lay in massive drifts, obscuring landmarks and filling depressions. The canyon below had nearly disappeared, its edges softened into gentle curves by the accumulated snow. No sign of their pursuers remained visible, though whether this meant safety or merely temporary reprieve remained to be seen. Ethan turned at the sound of movement behind him. Nayeli had risen and was rekindling their small fire from the carefully banked coals. In the dim light, her profile struck him with unexpected force. The straight line of her nose, the determined set of her jaw, the quiet dignity that seemed her natural state. "Storm still strong," she observed, glancing toward the entrance. "Weaker than yesterday, but still bad," Ethan confirmed, joining her by the fire. "Good for us. Covers our tracks." They ate a sparse breakfast of jerky and melted snow, rationing their dwindling supplies. The horses shifted restlessly, eager for food that was scarce in this barren shelter. Ethan stroked Rusty's neck, murmuring reassurances he wasn't sure he believed himself. "How far to Trapper Cabin?" Nayeli asked, packing their meager belongings with methodical efficiency. "If I'm right about where we are, maybe 10 miles west." Ethan frowned, studying the obscured landscape outside. "Hard to be certain in these conditions." Nayeli nodded, understanding the danger without elaboration. 10 miles in clear weather would be challenging enough. In this storm, with landmarks obscured and trails buried, it could prove impossible or fatal if they became disoriented. "We should wait," she suggested, practical as always. "Storm pass, then travel." Ethan considered this, weighing risks against necessities. Waiting meant depleting their limited supplies further, but traveling meant exposing themselves to the elements and potential disorientation. After careful deliberation, he agreed with her assessment. "We'll wait until midday. If the storm breaks, we'll push on. If not..." He left the alternative unspoken. The morning passed in enforced idleness. They tended the horses, mended their gear as best they could, and took turns watching the canyon below for any sign of pursuit. Nayeli occupied herself by using Ethan's knife to carve a small whistle from a pine branch, the repetitive action seeming to calm her. "For signal," she explained when she caught his curious glance. "Different sounds for different warnings." Ethan nodded, impressed by her foresight. "Smart. We should establish signals, 1 whistle for danger, 2 for all clear, that sort of thing. As they worked out a simple code, Ethan found himself studying Nayeli with growing appreciation. Her resourcefulness and resilience continued to surprise him, defying the expectations ingrained by years of frontier prejudice. In her, he saw not the savage of army propaganda, but a woman of intelligence and dignity navigating a world determined to deny her both. By midday, fortune favored them. The storm began to abate, snow falling less heavily, visibility improving to reveal sections of the canyon they'd been unable to see earlier. Ethan made the decision to move on, knowing that each hour of daylight was precious in their current circumstances. They saddled the horses and packed their few belongings, obliterating all signs of their presence as best they could. Before departing, Nayeli knelt briefly at the edge of their shelter, sprinkled a small amount of dried herbs from her pouch, and murmured words in her native tongue. "Giving thanks," Ethan asked when she rejoined him. She nodded. "To spirits of place, for shelter, for protection." A faint smile touched her lips. "Maybe help, little more, yes." Ethan returned the smile, finding comfort in her simple ritual, despite his own lapsed faith. "We'll take all the help we can get." They set out following the rim of the canyon westward. The going was treacherous, fresh snow concealing ice, and loose stones the path sometimes disappearing entirely beneath massive drifts. They were forced to dismount frequently, leading the horses through particularly hazardous sections. Nayeli moved with surprising confidence in the difficult terrain, sometimes taking the lead when Ethan hesitated at an unclear trail. Her connection to the land seemed intuitive, an ability to read subtle signs invisible to his trained but different eye. "How do you know which way?" he asked, after she correctly identified a trail completely buried under snow. "Wind shapes snow differently over open ground," she explained, pointing to subtle contours, "and animals still use trails even in winter. Small marks." She gestured to nearly invisible indentations that, now that she'd pointed them out, formed a clear pattern. "You'd have made a good scout," Ethan remarked, genuinely impressed. "My people scout these mountains long before white men come," she replied, not boastful, but matter-of-fact. "Knowledge passes down, like stories." By mid-afternoon they had covered perhaps 5 miles, half the distance to their destination, but a significant achievement given the conditions. The storm had retreated to occasional flurries, revealing a landscape of austere beauty. Snow-laden pines stood like sentinels against the gray sky. Rocky outcroppings broke through the white blanket in dramatic contrast, and occasionally they glimpsed valleys far below where rivers ran black between white banks. At a high ridge that offered a sweeping view of the terrain ahead, Ethan paused to consult his compass and get his bearings. Landmarks were beginning to look familiar, a distinctive twin-peaked mountain to the northwest, a curved valley leading toward a narrow pass. "I think we're on the right track," he said, relief evident in his voice. "The trapper's cabin should be in that valley about an hour before the pass." Nayeli nodded, surveying the route with thoughtful eyes. Then her gaze shifted, focusing on something in the distance behind them. Her body tensed. "Riders," she said quietly, pointing toward a ridge they had crossed earlier. Ethan followed her gesture, squinting against the bright snow. At first he saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye, dark figures against the white landscape following their trail. At least 4 horsemen, possibly more, still distant but moving with purpose. "Blackwood," he muttered. "Persistent bastard." "They find trail faster than I thought." Nayeli observed concern, but not panic in her voice. Ethan considered their options. The riders were at least an hour behind them, but moving more quickly now that the storm had cleared. They could try to outpace them, push on toward the cabin at maximum speed. But the horses were already tired, and hurrying in this terrain invited accidents that could prove fatal. "We can't outrun them," he decided. "Not in these conditions. We need to outsmart them." Nayeli waited, trusting his experience. "There's a fork in the canyon ahead," Ethan explained, recalling the terrain from his scouting days. "One branch leads toward the pass and the cabin. The other ends in a box canyon no way through except back the way you came." Understanding dawned in Nayeli's eyes. "False trail." "Exactly. We leave obvious signs heading toward the box canyon, then double back and take the correct route. With luck, they'll waste hours following the wrong path." Without further discussion, they mounted and continued westward now, with renewed urgency. When they reached the fork Ethan had described, they implemented their plan with meticulous attention to detail. They rode a short distance into the box canyon branch, deliberately leaving clear tracks. Then they dismounted, and walking backward in their own footprints, carefully obscured the last section of trail before returning to the fork. For the true path, they took elaborate precautions, wrapping the horses' hooves in strips of fabric to minimize tracks brushing snow over any marks they couldn't avoid making, moving from rock to rock, where possible to leave minimal signs of passage. "Will it work?" Nayeli asked, as they paused to rest the horses after the taxing maneuver. "Depends how good their tracker is," Ethan admitted, "but the fresh snow works in our favor, and Blackwood's impatience might do the rest." They pressed on, following the correct branch of the canyon as it wound toward the mountain pass. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, narrow ledges, steep inclines, areas where avalanches had obliterated the trail entirely. Each obstacle slowed their progress, the afternoon waning as they fought their way forward. As dusk approached, Ethan began to worry they'd miscalculated. The cabin should have been visible by now, yet nothing broke the endless expanse of snow and stone. Had he remembered wrong? Had the cabin been destroyed in the years since he'd last seen it? The consequences of such an error would be severe. Night in the open at this elevation, with their pursuers closing in, could mean death. Then, as they rounded a sharp bend in the trail, Nayeli pointed ahead. "There!" Nearly invisible against the hillside, the cabin's weathered logs blended with the surrounding pines. Snow had drifted against its walls and half buried its small porch, but smoke rose from its stone chimney, a thin, almost imperceptible wisp, against the darkening sky. Ethan reined in sharply. "Smoke," he said unnecessarily. "Someone's there." They exchanged a wary glance, the same thought evident in both their expressions. Friend or foe, sanctuary or trap. After all they'd endured to reach this point, the sight of that smoke represented either salvation or final disaster. "Options?" Nayeli asked, practical as always. Ethan considered the approaching night, their exhausted condition, the riders still presumably in pursuit. "Not many. Can't go back. Can't survive the night in the open. So we approach carefully," she concluded. "Ready for anything." They left the horses concealed among a stand of pines and advanced on foot, using the gathering darkness and falling snow for cover. As they drew closer, details of the cabin emerged: sturdy construction, despite its age, a small corral at the rear, where two horses stood beneath a lean-to shelter, light flickering behind a window, covered with oiled paper. At the edge of the clearing, they paused for final assessment. No obvious signs of military presence, the horses in the corral were pack animals, not cavalry mounts, and no sentries patrolled the perimeter. Still, caution seemed the wisest course. "I'll approach alone," Ethan decided. "Less threatening. You cover me from here." Nayeli frowned, clearly disliking the plan, but nodded reluctantly. She accepted his revolver, adding it to the knife already concealed in her dress. "Be careful," she said simply. Ethan squeezed her hand briefly, then moved into the open, approaching the cabin, with deliberate steps that crunched in the snow. He stopped several yards from the door, not wanting to appear threatening to whoever waited inside. "Hello, the cabin," he called, using the traditional greeting of the frontier. "Traveler seeking shelter." Silence followed his call. Then the sound of movement inside a shadow passing across the papered window. The door opened a crack, then wider, revealing a figure silhouetted against the warm light from within. "State your business," a gruff voice demanded, not hostile, but wary. "Name's Ethan Sawyer," he replied truthfully. "My companion and I are caught in the mountains. Storm drove us off the main trail. We saw your smoke." The figure in the doorway stepped forward into the fading light, an older man with a white beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the wilderness. He carried a shotgun, not pointed at Ethan, but ready nonetheless. "Companion?" the man questioned, eyes scanning the tree line. Ethan hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal. The old man's next words decided him. "Indian woman, is it? The one they're hunting?" The question carried no malice, merely certainty. "Better bring her in, too, before those soldiers circle back." Shock must have shown on Ethan's face, for the old man gave a short, humorless laugh. "News travels even up here. Army patrol came through yesterday asking questions, not too subtle about their business." He gestured impatiently. "Well, you coming in or freezing out there?" Ethan turned and signaled to Nayeli, who emerged cautiously from the trees, approaching with understandable wariness. The old man watched her with shrewd assessment, but no evident prejudice. "I'm Jacob Harden," he introduced himself as they reached the porch. "Former trapper, current hermit. Welcome to my humble abode." He stepped aside, ushering them into the cabin's warmth. "Bring your horses round back when you're settled. Storm's picking up again." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A single room with a stone fireplace occupying most of one wall. Rudimentary furniture, crafted from pine shelves, stocked with provisions and supplies that spoke of careful preparation for winter isolation. A pot of something savory bubbled over the fire, the aroma making Ethan suddenly aware of his hunger. "Sit," Harden instructed, gesturing to the rough-hewn table. "I'll fetch your mounts. No sense you going back out in that cold." Before they could protest, he had donned a heavy coat and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Ethan and Nayeli exchanged bemused glances, the unexpected hospitality leaving them momentarily wrong-footed. "Can we trust?" Nayeli asked quietly, her hand still near the concealed knife. "Not sure yet," Ethan admitted. "But he could have shot us from the doorway if that was his intention. And he knew about the soldiers." They used the old man's absence to take stock of their surroundings. The cabin showed signs of long habitation, well-worn paths in the plank flooring tools, and implements arranged with the efficiency of routine, a collection of books on a small shelf that suggested a mind not entirely surrendered to wilderness isolation. Harden returned several minutes later, stamping snow from his boots. "Horses are settled. Fine animals. That chestnut's seen some miles." He hung his coat on a peg by the door and moved to the fireplace, stirring the contents of the pot. "Hope you like venison stew. It's what's for dinner." As their host busied himself serving the meal, Ethan studied him with cautious assessment. Harden moved with the deliberate economy of an aging body that still retained much of its strength. His clothing was frontier practical buckskin pants, woolen shirt, moccasins rather than boots inside the cabin. A former trapper turned recluse by his own description, yet something in his bearing suggested more complex origins. "You said soldiers came through yesterday," Ethan remarked as Harden set bowls of stew before them. "What exactly were they looking for?" The old man settled across from them, fixing Ethan with a penetrating gaze. "Cut the dance, Sawyer. They were looking for her." He nodded toward Nayeli. Cheyenne woman accused of killing an officer. Offered a reward that might tempt a man living alone in these mountains. His weathered face creased in a sardonic smile. Fortunately, I've never been particularly tempted by army gold. Nayeli met the old man's gaze steadily. Why you help strangers dangerous for you? Hardin's expression sobered. I've seen what passes for army justice these days, especially where Indians are concerned. He spooned stew into his mouth, chewed thoughtfully. Besides, I knew James Reed, the officer you supposedly killed. Wouldn't shed tears over that one truth be told. Ethan and Nayeli exchanged surprised glances. You knew Reed, Ethan asked. How? Crossed paths a few times over the years. He frequented a trading post down in the valley before it closed. Man had a taste for whiskey and a temper that came with it. Hardin's eyes shifted to Nayeli. Treated the local Cheyenne women like they were his personal property. Caused trouble more than once. He led attack on my village, Nayeli said quietly. Many die, including my family. Hardin nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. Not surprised. Reed always struck me as a man looking for an excuse to violence. He fixed her with a direct gaze. But you didn't kill him, did you? No. My brother, after Reed shoot at me. She gestured to her healing leg wound. And you're taking the blame to protect him. It wasn't a question, but Nayeli nodded anyway. Hardin grunted, seemingly satisfied with her honesty. The sergeant leading the search party, Blackwood, he seems particularly determined, Ethan observed, watching for Hardin's reaction. The old man's face darkened. Marcus Blackwood, another piece of work. He and Reed were two-of-a-kind men who joined the army for the license to cruelty it sometimes provides. He set down his spoon with deliberate care. If Blackwood's leading the hunt, this is about more than a dead officer. He was at Village 2, Nayeli confirmed. Lead second attack. Kill many women children at River. Witnesses, Hardin concluded grimly. You're witnesses to atrocities that could end his career, possibly see him hanged. That explains the persistence. The meal continued with subdued conversation, each lost in private thoughts. The stew, hot, hearty, and the first proper meal they'd had in days, restored some of their depleted strength. Outside, the wind rose again, snow pattering against the cabin's small window. After dinner, Hardin showed them where they could sleep, a small alcove partitioned from the main room by a hanging blanket containing a narrow pallet that would be cramped but infinitely preferable to another night exposed to the elements. Rest, the old man advised. You look dead on your feet, both of you. We'll talk more in the morning. Exhaustion made the suggestion irresistible. Despite lingering questions about their unexpected host, the relative safety of the cabin and the day's grueling journey combined to overcome caution. Within minutes of lying down on the shared pallet, both Ethan and Nayeli had fallen into deep sleep, bodies curled together for warmth and comfort in the small space. Ethan woke once during the night, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Through a gap in the hanging blanket, he could see Hardin seated by the fire rifle across his knees, apparently standing watch. The sight was both reassuring and puzzling the old man's vigilance, suggesting genuine concern for their safety, rather than duplicity. Morning arrived with continued snowfall, heavy flakes drifting past the cabin's frosted window. Ethan woke to find Nayeli already up, helping Hardin prepare a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried berries. The two spoke quietly together, Nayeli's limited English supplemented by gestures that the old man seemed to understand intuitively. Your companion knows her plants, Hardin remarked as Ethan joined them. Been showing me some preparations I hadn't considered. Useful knowledge up here, where doctors are scarce. Nayeli acknowledged the compliment with a small nod, continuing to work with a collection of dried herbs she'd apparently produced from her small pouch. The easy cooperation between them suggested a rapport had developed, while Ethan slept perhaps a shared understanding of life lived close to the land, despite their different backgrounds. Over breakfast, Hardin provided information that clarified their situation. Blackwood came through with 5 men, 2 Army 3 local scouts. They're quartered down at Simmons's place in the valley, using it as a base for their search. Simmons, Ethan questioned. Trapper turned rancher. Small spread about 8 miles southeast of here. Not a bad sort, but not one to refuse Army business either. Hardin sipped his coffee thoughtfully. They've been methodically searching the eastern approaches. Haven't come up this way yet, but it's just a matter of time. We led them toward the Box Canyon, Ethan explained. Might buy us a day at most. Hardin nodded. Smart move, but Blackwood's no fool for all his other failings. He'll figure it out eventually. He studied them with shrewd assessment. So, what's your plan? Can't stay here indefinitely. Supplies won't last. And Blackwood's the persistent type. It was the question they had been avoiding what came next in this desperate flight. The temporary reprieve of Hardin's cabin couldn't disguise the fundamental problem. They were fugitives in hostile territory with limited options for long-term safety. North Nayeli suggested after a moment's consideration. To my people, safety in numbers. Hardin shook his head. Northern Cheyenne territory is nearly 200 miles from here. In summer, maybe. In winter, through Army patrols, suicide mission. What about west? Ethan proposed. Over the mountains to the next territory. Same problem. Passes are treacherous this time of year, if not completely impassable. Hardin stroked his beard thoughtfully, and Blackwood would anticipate that move have men watching the major routes. A heavy silence fell as the implication sank in. They were effectively trapped the mountain's winter, and their pursuers forming a noose that tightened with each passing day. There is one possibility, Hardin said finally, his tone suggesting reluctance. Though you might not like it. They looked at him expectantly. Cedar Creek. You're Dr. Walker. Ethan frowned in confusion. Walker, how do you know about him? Man gets around, treats folks up here when he can make the journey. Good doctor, better man. Hardin set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. He's also the only person within 50 miles with enough influence to potentially help your situation. Going back to town would be walking into Blackwood's hands, Ethan objected. Not necessarily, not if you have evidence. Hardin's gaze shifted to Nayeli. You witnessed Reed and Blackwood's actions at your village. Others survived too, yes, she nodded slowly. Yes, many die, but some escape. Testimony alone might not be enough against Army officers, Hardin continued. But Walker mentioned something when he was up here last fall. A government investigation into incidents along the frontier. Indian Bureau sending representatives to document complaints. Ethan's interest sharpened. Official investigators in Cedar Creek. Due any day now, according to what Walker told me, part of some new policy out of Washington. Hardin leaned forward, his expression intent. If you could speak to them, provide first-hand testimony about what happened at the village. Blackwood would be finished, Ethan concluded, understanding dawning. His career at minimum, possibly criminal charges. And he knows it, Hardin added grimly. Why he's so desperate to find you before the investigators arrive. The possibility hung before them, a desperate gamble that could either end their flight or end their lives. Return to Cedar Creek, potentially walking into a trap on the chance of reaching officials who might provide justice. How we get past Blackwood, Nayeli asked practically. He watched town trails. That's where I come in, Hardin said, rising to retrieve a map from a shelf. He spread it on the table, pointing to various landmarks. There's a back way into town, old mining trail hardly used these days. Comes in behind the church away from the main street. If Walker knows you're coming, he could arrange a meeting with the investigators before Blackwood even knows you're there. Ethan studied the map, mind racing through possibilities and dangers. We'd need to get word to Walker first, and even then, it's a hell of a risk. Life is risk, son, Hardin replied philosophically. Question is whether the potential reward justifies it. They spent the morning discussing details, contingencies, alternatives. By midday, a tentative plan had formed. Hardin would travel to Cedar Creek the following day, ostensibly to trade furs and replenish supplies. While there, he would make contact with Dr. Walker, conveying their situation and the proposed meeting with the government investigators. If Walker confirmed the investigators' presence and could arrange a secure meeting, Hardin would return with that information. If not, if the situation in town seemed too dangerous or the investigators hadn't arrived, they would revert to the riskier plan of attempting to reach the Northern Cheyenne territory when weather permitted. It's still a gamble, Ethan acknowledged as they concluded their planning. But it offers a chance at a real solution, not just endless running. Nayeli had remained thoughtful throughout the discussion, speaking little but listening intently. Now she looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze directly. I want to end this. For my people. For those who died. Her voice was steady, determined. We'll take risk. The decision made, they settled in to wait out the day. Hardin would depart at first light, using the continuing snowfall as cover for his journey. Until then, they focused on practical matters, resting, tending their gear, helping their host with chores around the cabin in exchange for his assistance. As evening approached, Hardin announced his intention to check his trap lines before dark. Might as well collect what I can while I'm out, he explained. Makes my trip to town tomorrow look more natural. After he departed, Ethan and Nayeli found themselves alone in the cabin for the first time since their arrival. The enforced intimacy of their flight had created a connection between them that transcended language or cultural differences, yet neither had spoken openly of what that connection might mean beyond their immediate circumstances. Nayeli busied herself sorting the herbs she'd been working with earlier, separating them into small bundles that she tied with sinew. Ethan watched her nimble fingers work, struck anew by the quiet competence she brought to every task. What are those for? He asked, breaking the comfortable silence. She glanced up, a small smile touching her lips. Medicine. For Hardin. Payment for help. He seems to have taken a liking to you, Ethan observed. You have that effect on gruff old men who live alone in the wilderness. The teasing comment, his first attempt at humor since their flight began, earned a genuine smile that transformed her face. First you, now him, she agreed with mock solemnity. Perhaps special power. Ethan chuckled, surprised by how natural the moment felt, despite their desperate circumstances. What did you two talk about this morning while I was still asleep? Plants. Healing, old ways. She tied off another bundle neatly. He know much about mountain. Respect nature. Like my people. She hesitated, then added more softly, he lose wife too, long ago. Understand? Empty place inside. The observation sobered Ethan. He hadn't considered that Hardin might have experienced similar loss, though it explained something of the old man's solitary existence. Did he say what happened to her? Nayeli shook her head. Just say she gone. Long time. That some wounds never heal. Just learn to carry. She met Ethan's gaze directly. He right about that. The simple statement carried profound understanding recognition of the grief they both carried, losses that had shaped their lives in ways neither had fully articulated. In Nayeli's dark eyes, Ethan saw not pity, but companionship in sorrow, an acknowledgement that they had both survived wounds that would never completely heal. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "He's right about that." Nayeli set aside her herbs and moved to the fireplace, adding a log to the flames. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the strong lines of her face, the intricate braid she'd woven into her hair that morning. She knelt there a moment, seemingly lost in thought, then spoke without turning. "If plan work, if we reach town, speak to these government men." She paused, searching for words. What happened after? The question held implications beyond its simple phrasing. After. If they survived, if justice was somehow served, what then? Would they go their separate ways? She to her people, he to what his homestead was burned, his solitary life disrupted beyond repair. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, moving to join her by the fire. "Haven't thought that far ahead." She nodded, accepting his honesty. "Hard to see beyond danger. Beyond now." "Yes." He studied her profile in the firelight, struck by how essential her presence had become in the short time they'd known each other. "But I know I don't want to go back to how things were before. Alone." Nayeli turned to face him, her expression open, vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "Alone is hard way," she repeated her words from days earlier. "For both." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His hand lingered there, cupping her face with gentle reverence. "Nayeli," he said softly, her name itself a question. She answered by leaning into his touch, her hand rising to cover his. "Ethan," she replied, her accent making his name sound new, significant. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable, not the desperate grabbing of two people facing death, but the deliberate choice of souls recognizing something vital in each other. Her lips were soft against his, hesitant at first, then responding with increasing certainty. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, feeling the solidity of her presence, the warmth of her body against his. When they separated, her dark eyes searched his face, as if memorizing its contours. "This real?" she asked quietly. "Not just fear danger making us reach out." The question revealed her intelligence, her unwillingness to mistake circumstantial intimacy for deeper connection. Ethan considered his answer carefully, wanting to offer nothing less than complete honesty. "I think danger stripped away barriers that might have kept us apart in normal times," he said finally. "But what I feel, what's growing between us, that's real. At least for me." She nodded slowly, satisfaction rather than surprise in her expression. "For me also." Her hand found his fingers interlacing with natural ease. "Whatever comes tomorrow, glad I found you, even in such darkness." The simple declaration moved him deeply. Before he could respond, however, the sound of approaching footsteps outside alerted them to Hardin's return. They separated with reluctance, the moment suspended, rather than broken. The old man entered in a flurry of snow and cold air, carrying several small animal carcasses. His traps had been productive despite the weather. If he noticed the lingering atmosphere between his guests, he gave no sign, merely nodding in greeting as he set about preparing his catch for skinning. The evening passed in practical activity, helping Hardin with his traps, preparing a meal together, discussing final details of the plan for the following day. Yet beneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of anticipation, a heightened awareness between Ethan and Nayeli that transformed the humble cabin into a space of possibility despite the dangers that still surrounded them. That night, as they retired to their shared pallet behind the hanging blanket, the nature of their closeness had changed. No longer merely pragmatic, their embrace carried meaning, a conscious choice rather than mere necessity. Nayeli's head found its place against Ethan's shoulder, as if designed for that purpose, his arm encircling her with protective tenderness. "Sleep," she murmured, sensing his wakefulness. "Need strength tomorrow." Ethan pressed a kiss to her forehead, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "I keep thinking about what happens if this works. If we survive this." She shifted slightly, looking up at him in the dim light filtering through the blanket. "Think of good things. Place where Cheyenne white men can live without fear. Where children grow strong, free." Her voice softened. "Maybe our children someday." The vision she offered simple, hopeful, defiant, in the face of a world that would deny its possibility, struck Ethan with unexpected force. He had not allowed himself to imagine a future not since Margaret's death. Yet now, holding Nayeli in the darkness of a mountain cabin while killers searched for them, he found himself reaching for that vision, wanting to believe in its possibility. "Our children," he repeated softly, the words themselves a kind of prayer. She nestled closer, her breathing gradually slowing as sleep claimed her. Ethan remained awake longer, listening to the wind outside, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart against his chest. Whatever tomorrow might bring, salvation or further danger, this moment, this connection already represented a kind of victory against the forces that had driven them to this remote shelter. With that thought, he finally surrendered to sleep. Dreams filled not with the usual specters of war and loss, but with images of spring meadows, children's laughter, and Nayeli's face in morning sunlight. Dawn arrived crisp and clear, the storm having passed during the night. Hardin rose early, preparing for his journey to Cedar Creek with methodical efficiency. He would travel light and fast, following valleys rather than ridgelines to minimize his visibility. "Should reach town by midday, if the trail's passable," he explained as he packed minimal provisions and ammunition. "With luck, I'll be back tomorrow evening with news from Walker." "And if you're not back?" Ethan asked, voicing the concern they all felt. Hardin's weathered face creased in a grim smile. "Then assume the worst and head north at the first opportunity. There's a map in that drawer." He nodded toward a small desk. "Shows routes the Army patrols don't know about. Old trappers' paths. Might get you through." The implication was clear. If Hardin failed to return, it likely meant capture or worse. A sobering reminder of the stakes involved in their desperate gamble. As the old man prepared to depart, Nayeli approached him with the carefully bundled herbs she'd prepared the previous day. "For wounds, fever, pain," she explained, placing them in his pack. "Thank you for help." Hardin accepted the gift with surprising grace. "Appreciate it. Getting too old for this mountain life without something to ease these bones." He glanced between Ethan and Nayeli, his expression softening momentarily. "Take care of each other while I'm gone. You've found something rare in this hard country, worth protecting." With that parting wisdom, he shouldered his pack and rifle, setting out on the snow-covered trail with the steady gait of a man accustomed to wilderness journeys. They watched until he disappeared around a bend, then returned to the cabin's warmth to begin their anxious wait. The day passed with excruciating slowness. They occupied themselves with necessary tasks, tending the horses, chopping firewood, repairing gear, but anxiety colored every activity. By unspoken agreement, they avoided discussing the various ways Hardin's mission might fail, focusing instead on practical preparations for whatever news he might bring. As evening approached with no sign of their host, Ethan took up position at the small window, watching the trail for any movement. Nayeli joined him, her presence a silent comfort, as darkness began to fall. "He said tomorrow evening," she reminded gently, "not expect tonight." "I know," Ethan acknowledged, "just wary of surprises." They prepared a simple meal from Hardin's supplies, eating in contemplative silence. The cabin felt different, without the old man's gruff presence, emptier somehow, the dangers outside more immediate, without his confident assurances. After darkness had fully descended, they secured the cabin for the night, banking the fire and checking that weapons remained within easy reach. The routine had become familiar over their days of flight, yet now carried additional weight, a recognition that tomorrow might bring either salvation or renewed danger. In the small alcove that had become their private space, they held each other close, finding comfort in proximity, despite the uncertainty that surrounded them. Words seemed inadequate to the moment, their communication instead expressed through touch. Nayeli's hand resting over Ethan's heart, his fingers tracing the contours of her face in the darkness. Morning brought clear skies and rising temperatures, the first hint that winter's grip might eventually loosen. They went about their tasks with heightened alertness, each sound from outside causing them to pause and listen. By mid-morning, Ethan had taken to spending time in Hardin's small loft, using the old man's spyglass to survey the approach to the cabin. "Rider coming," he announced shortly after noon, the spyglass trained on a distant figure moving along the valley floor. "Single horseman. Can't make out who yet." Nayeli joined him at the small window, her expression tense. "Hardin, too far to tell, right direction though." They watched in taut silence as the rider drew gradually closer. The horse moved with the labored gait of an animal that had been pushed, hard steam rising from its flanks despite the cold. The rider hunched forward in the saddle, head bowed against the wind. "It's Hardin," Ethan confirmed, finally, relief evident in his voice. "Alone, I think." They hurried outside as the old man approached the cabin. Hardin dismounted stiffly, his face lined with exhaustion. Without preamble, he handed the reins to Ethan. "Get him rubbed down and fed," he instructed. "Poor beast's earned it." Inside, after tending to the horse, they gathered around the table as Hardin warmed himself by the fire. The old man's expression was grave, his usual taciturn manner replaced by evident concern. "What happened?" Ethan prompted when Hardin remained silent. "Did you speak with Walker?" "I did." Hardin accepted a cup of coffee from Nayeli, his hands showing a slight tremor, whether from exhaustion or agitation wasn't clear. "News is mixed. The government investigators arrived yesterday, 2 of them staying at the hotel in town." Hope flared briefly, but Hardin's somber expression quickly tempered it. "Blackwood knows they're there. He's positioned men on all approaches to town, checking everyone coming or going. And he's accelerated the search parties. There were fresh tracks near the box canyon. They've figured out your ruse." Ethan absorbed this information with growing concern. "What about Walker? Can he help?" "He's willing to try. Says he can arrange a meeting with the investigators at his office back entrance after dark." Hardin sipped his coffee, grimacing either at its temperature or the situation. "But getting you into town undetected?" He shook his head. "Nearly impossible now." "There must be a way," Ethan insisted. "You mentioned an old mining trail. Watched? One of the first places Blackwood posted men." Hardin set down his cup with a decisive thunk. "There is one possibility, but it's damned risky. Walker suggested it." They waited expectantly as the old man collected his thoughts. "Tomorrow's Sunday. Church services in the morning. Most of the town will be there, including the investigators. Blackwood's maintaining appearances, so he'll attend too. Hardin leaned forward, his voice lowering despite their isolation. Walker thinks if you could reach the church during the service, speak directly to the investigators in front of witnesses, Blackwood wouldn't dare interfere openly. A public confrontation, Ethan said slowly, considering the strategy. With too many witnesses for Blackwood to silence. Exactly. Risky as hell, but if it works, Hardin didn't need to finish the thought. Success would mean an end to their flight official testimony recorded potential justice for Nayeli's people. How we reach church? Nayeli asked practically. If all roads watched, that's the truly dangerous part, Hardin admitted. You'd have to come in during the night, hide somewhere in town until morning. Walker suggested his surgery. He keeps it locked, but you know where he hides the spare key. Ethan nodded, remembering Walker mentioning its location during one of his rare visits to the homestead. Under the third stone of the back step. The church is just across the alley from his office. Short distance, but entirely exposed. Hardin's gaze moved between them, measuring their reaction. I told him I'd present the option, but that the decision was yours. Silence fell as they contemplated the plan, audacious, desperate, with equal potential for salvation or disaster. After a long moment, Ethan looked to Nayeli, recognizing that the greater risk fell to her. Your choice, he said quietly. Your life at stake. Nayeli considered her expression revealing the internal calculation of dangers and possibilities. If we succeed, investigators record testimony, make official. Hardin nodded. According to Walker, that's their purpose, documenting incidents for some report to Congress. And this help other Cheyennes stop more attacks. Possibly. At minimum, it could end Blackwood's career, prevent him from leading more raids. Nayeli straightened decision evident in her posture before she spoke. Then we go. Worth risk. Ethan reached for her hand across the table, squeezing it gently in support. Together, then. The remainder of the day was consumed with preparations. Hardin provided detailed information about the situation in town, which roads were watched, where Blackwood's men were quartered, the schedule of church services. Walker had supplied additional intelligence through Hardin, including the investigators' names and backgrounds. Ambrose Jenkins and Thomas Powell, Hardin reported, Indian Bureau officials from Washington. Jenkins is the senior man, former Army officer turned bureaucrat. Powell's younger, some kind of clerk or secretary, taking testimonies, collecting evidence for their report. Any sense of their sympathies? Ethan asked, knowing that even official investigators might harbor prejudices that would color their reception of Nayeli's testimony. Walker says Jenkins seems genuinely concerned about the situation, professional, not obviously biased. Powell follows his lead. Hardin stroked his beard thoughtfully. Florence Miller spoke with them yesterday. She thinks they're honorable men for what that's worth. The mention of Florence, the shrewd widow who ran the general store, sparked Ethan's interest. Is she helping Walker? In her way. Nothing overt, but she's spreading word among certain townspeople, creating an atmosphere where Blackwood can't act too freely. Hardin's expression suggested grudging admiration. Formidable woman, that one. By evening, they had established as comprehensive a plan as circumstances allowed. They would depart before dawn, following a circuitous route to approach Cedar Creek from the west, the direction least expected given their last known position. Hardin would remain at the cabin, providing a plausible explanation for their presence in the area if questioned later. The night before their dangerous journey passed in restless anticipation. Sleep came in fitful intervals, interrupted by necessary adjustments to their plan or simple anxiety about the risks ahead. Ethan and Nayeli held each other close during these wakeful periods, drawing strength from a connection that had grown from desperate circumstances into something neither had anticipated, but both now cherished. "Are you afraid?" Ethan asked, during one such interlude, feeling her wakefulness in the tension of her body beside him. "Yes," she answered simply, honest as always. "But fear not stop me, not when matters so important." Her courage humbled him. Everything she had endured, the massacre of her village, the loss of her family, the wound that still pained her, the relentless pursuit, and still she faced the coming danger with clear-eyed determination. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "I want you to know that meeting you, it changed something in me, something I thought was dead." Nayeli shifted to look at him in the darkness, her hand coming to rest against his cheek. "In me also," she whispered. "You show me not all white men same, that good hearts exist even after so much hate." Her voice carried both sadness and hope. Maybe if others see this too someday, peace possible. The simplicity of her vision, a world where people might be judged by their actions rather than their origins, struck Ethan with its profound wisdom. In their brief time together, crossing boundaries of culture and language, they had discovered a common humanity that transcended the artificial divisions imposed by history and prejudice. As dawn approached, they rose and made final preparations. Dressed in their warmest clothing, weapons concealed but accessible, they said their farewells to Hardin. The old man had been transformed from suspicious host to ally in the space of days, his gruff exterior hiding a fundamental decency that circumstances had finally revealed. "Good luck to you both," he said simply, shaking Ethan's hand and nodding respectfully to Nayeli. "World could use more of what you've found together." They mounted their horses as the eastern sky began to lighten, the first pink tendrils of dawn reaching over the mountain peaks. The trail ahead would be difficult, the dangers at its end potentially fatal. Yet, as they set out, Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever awaited them in Cedar Creek, justice, or further struggle, safety, or continued danger, they would face it together. Two people from vastly different worlds, united by circumstance, but connected by something deeper, riding toward an uncertain future that for the first time in years held the possibility of hope. Behind them, Jacob Hardin watched their departure from the cabin door, his weathered face inscrutable in the growing light. As they disappeared into the trees, following the snow-covered trail that would lead them to their final confrontation with Marcus Blackwood, the old man raised a hand in silent blessing, a gesture unseen by the departing riders, but heartfelt nonetheless. The path before them wound down from the mountains toward Cedar Creek, where a desperate gamble awaited. Whether that gamble would bring justice or disaster remained to be seen. But in finding each other amid the storm and chaos of their flight, Ethan Sawyer and Nayeli had already achieved a victory of sorts. A connection that defied the hatred and division of their time, a spark of possibility in a world of snow and shadow. Fire through snow, warmth persisting against the bitter cold, hope kindled in the darkest season.